The Russian Empire had conquered Siberia, but by the late 19th century, it still faced an enemy that no army had ever truly defeated: distance. On a map, the empire seemed almost impossible. It stretched from the forests and farmlands of Eastern Europe across the Ural Mountains, over the endless plains of Siberia, through enormous river valleys and dark forests, until at last it reached the cold shores of the Pacific Ocean. From west to east, it covered thousands upon thousands of miles. Yet a line drawn on a map was not the same thing as a country held together. A government official in Saint Petersburg could place his finger on Vladivostok and call it Russian territory, but reaching that distant port was another matter entirely. Before the Great Railway existed, a journey across Siberia could involve horse-drawn carts, river steamers, rough roads, frozen tracks, ferries, mud, snow, and weeks or months of exhausting travel. Goods moved slowly. People moved slowly. Orders moved slowly. Even as the telegraph began to make messages faster, the physical empire remained divided by an almost unimaginable geography. And beyond the Ural Mountains lay Siberia. To many people in Western Russia, Siberia was less a familiar region than a distant idea. It was a place of exile and punishment, but also of forests, gold, fur, coal, farmland, rivers, and possibility. It was a land where winter could freeze rivers solid, where summer could turn roads into swamps, where settlements appeared as tiny islands of wood and smoke, surrounded by hundreds of miles of wilderness. For generations, travelers had crossed it by old post roads and waterways. Then, during the 19th century, a new idea slowly became impossible to ignore. What if Russia could build a railway through it? Not a short railway between neighboring cities. Not a line serving one mining district or one commercial port. A railway that would stretch across a continent. A railway that would link European Russia with the Pacific. It would cross forests where there were almost no roads, bridge rivers wider than many European valleys, pass through frozen ground, skirt mountains, endure spring floods, and somehow continue through landscapes that seemed to resist permanent construction. It would require money on a scale few could easily imagine. It would require engineers willing to work thousands of miles from home. It would require enormous numbers of laborers, including peasants, migrants, soldiers, convicts, and men whose names would never appear in official histories. And it would require something more difficult to measure: patience. Because the Trans-Siberian Railway was not simply built. It was argued over, surveyed, revised, delayed, extended, broken, repaired, and slowly forced into existence. Tonight, we are going to follow that iron road from the moment it existed only as a troublesome idea on a map. We will travel into the Taiga with the men who carried rails into the wilderness. We will stand beside the great Siberian rivers. We will cross the frozen silence of Lake Baikal. We will watch stations become towns, towns become cities, and an isolated frontier become part of a rapidly changing world. And as the night grows quieter, we will listen to the sound that eventually came to define this enormous journey. Steel wheels moving steadily over steel rails. Eastward, always eastward, across the snow. Long before the first rails were laid across Siberia, there was a road. Calling it a road, however, might give the wrong impression. It was not a smooth highway, stretching confidently toward the Pacific. It was a changing collection of tracks, postal routes, river crossings, muddy paths, winter trails, and rough connections between settlements that had grown slowly across the enormous territory east of the Ural Mountains. For centuries, movement across Siberia followed the rhythm of the landscape. Where there were rivers, people traveled by water. Where the rivers froze, they sometimes traveled over the ice. Where forests became too dense, roads twisted around them or simply disappeared. Where spring thaw turned the ground into mud, journeys slowed almost to a halt. Distance was not measured only in miles. It was measured in weather, in horses, in food, in daylight, in how long a traveler could remain warm. and in whether the next settlement actually contained what the map promised. Russia had been expanding into Siberia since the late 16th and 17th centuries. Cossacks, traders, hunters, soldiers, missionaries, officials, and settlers moved gradually eastward, often following the great river systems. The attraction was obvious. Siberia contained extraordinary natural wealth. Its forests supplied valuable furs. Its soil, in some regions, could support agriculture. Its mountains and river valleys contained minerals. Gold discoveries would later draw prospectors deeper into the interior. Timber seemed almost limitless. Yet wealth hidden thousands of miles from the main centers of population had one fundamental problem. It was difficult to reach. A resource was only useful if people could transport it. And in Siberia, transportation was one of the great governing facts of life. A shipment of goods could travel by river for part of its journey, then wait for another form of transport. A merchant might load cargo onto carts, transfer it to boats, unload it again, move it across land, and repeat the process farther east. A journey that looked simple on a map became a chain of difficult decisions. The rivers themselves were enormous. The Obi, the Irtysh, the Yenisei, the Lena farther north, the Amur in the distant east. These rivers could function as highways during certain seasons, but they did not necessarily flow in the direction that travelers wished to go. Many of Siberia's greatest rivers run north toward the Arctic Ocean. Russia, however, increasingly needed movement from west to east. The geography of the country and the geography of its rivers were not always cooperative partners. Overland travel was hardly easier. The old Siberian route, often called the Siberian Tract or Great Siberian Road, connected western Russia with settlements farther east. For generations, it carried officials, merchants, soldiers, mail coaches, peasants, and prisoners. Its importance was enormous. Its comfort was not. Imagine leaving the familiar regions west of the Urals in a horse-drawn vehicle. At first, the road might seem merely rough. The wheels creak. Leather harnesses pull tight. Mud gathers around the rims. Behind you, church towers and cultivated fields slowly disappear. Then the settlements become smaller. Distances between stopping places grow longer. The road narrows. Forest closes around you. In winter, snow can erase the edges of the track. In spring, melting ice turns the ground into a heavy brown mixture that grips wheels and hooves. A carriage becomes stuck. Men climb down. They push. Horses strain. Someone places branches beneath a wheel. Several yards are gained. Then the vehicle sinks again. There were inns and postal stations along important sections of the route. There were changing stations for horses. There were villages where travelers could find food, heat, and information. But even with these networks, the journey was difficult enough that Siberia remained psychologically distant from the political center of the empire. To officials in Saint Petersburg, this was not merely inconvenient. It was dangerous. Russia was one of the largest political entities on Earth, but enormous size did not automatically create strength. In some ways, size created weakness. A territory that could not be reached quickly could not be administered quickly. A distant garrison was harder to supply. A remote governor had to make decisions with limited information. A region rich in resources might contribute only a fraction of its potential to the wider economy. Settlers who wanted to move east faced a journey so demanding that the journey itself became a barrier to settlement. And at the far eastern edge of the empire, another concern was growing: the Pacific. During the 19th century, Russia strengthened its position in the Far East. Territory along the Amur River and the Pacific coast became increasingly important. Vladivostok, founded in 1860, developed into a strategic port. Its name could be understood as an assertion of power toward the east. But there was a strange contradiction. Russia possessed a major Pacific harbor that was connected politically to the empire, yet reaching it overland from European Russia remained extremely difficult. The most practical travel route between Western Russia and the Pacific could sometimes involve going by sea through foreign waters rather than traveling directly across Russian territory. For an empire concerned with power, commerce, settlement, and security, this was difficult to accept. There was also the enormous fact of Siberia itself. In official reports and discussions, Siberia increasingly appeared not merely as a wilderness, but as a future agricultural region, a source of minerals, a place for new towns, a destination for migration, a bridge toward Asian markets. But all of these ambitions required movement. Without reliable transportation, Siberia remained full of unrealized possibility. The idea of railways had already transformed parts of Europe. By the middle and later decades of the 19th century, railway lines were changing the meaning of distance. Journeys that once required days could be completed in hours. Cities that had once depended upon slow wagon traffic could receive enormous quantities of freight by train. Coal, grain, timber, soldiers, passengers, mail, machinery, and news could move at speeds previous generations would have considered extraordinary. Russia was building its own railway network. Saint Petersburg and Moscow were connected by rail in the middle of the century. Other lines gradually spread across European Russia. Every new connection revealed what railways could do. They did more than carry passengers. They reorganized geography. A town beside a railway could suddenly become more important than a larger town that the tracks had bypassed. Markets expanded. Travel became more predictable. Military planners began calculating mobilization in railway timetables rather than in marching days. The clock itself became increasingly important. Departure time, arrival time, connection time. A railway imposed order upon space. But Siberia seemed to challenge the railway idea at every level. First, there was the distance. A line from the European side of Russia toward the Pacific would not simply be long. It would be one of the greatest railway projects ever attempted. Then there was population. Railways were expensive, and they were easiest to justify where large numbers of passengers and large quantities of freight already existed. Across much of Siberia, settlements were scattered. Some regions had only small populations separated by huge distances. To critics, this created an obvious question. Why build an immensely expensive railway through places where so few people lived? Supporters answered with an argument that would become central to the entire project. People would come because the railway existed. The line would not merely serve Siberia. It would change Siberia. It would create the traffic that critics said was missing. That argument contained both hope and risk. Railways could stimulate settlement and trade. But constructing thousands of miles of track, based partly on future expectations, required tremendous confidence. There were engineering doubts as well. European railway construction already demanded bridges, cuttings, embankments, drainage systems, surveying, and enormous volumes of material. Siberia added extremes of climate. Winter temperatures could become brutally low. Rivers froze. Then, during thaw, enormous masses of ice moved downstream. Spring transformed frozen ground into mud. Floodwaters could threaten embankments. Forests had to be cleared. Swamps had to be crossed. Supplies had to reach construction camps located far from established industrial centers. Even the most ordinary railway object became complicated when it had to be carried deep into the interior. A rail was heavy. A locomotive was heavier. Steel bridge components could not simply appear beside a distant Siberian river. They had to be manufactured, transported, unloaded, stored, protected, and assembled. Every mile completed made the next mile possible. But every mile also carried the workforce farther away from the world that supported it. There was another Siberia, too. A human Siberia. For generations, the region had been associated with exile. Political prisoners, criminal convicts, and other people sentenced by the imperial state had been sent eastward. Some traveled in groups under guard. Some were assigned to settlements or labor. The long journey into exile became one of the darkest images associated with Siberia in Russian culture and European imagination. Chains, dust in summer, snow in winter, a road disappearing east. Yet Siberia was never only a prison landscape. That image obscured millions of ordinary lives. Indigenous peoples had inhabited Siberian regions long before Russian expansion. Russian peasants created villages. Merchants operated riverboats and shops. Hunters entered the forests. Fishermen worked along rivers and lakes. Families were born and buried there. Children who had never seen Moscow or Saint Petersburg grew up beneath Siberian skies and considered the region home. For these people, Siberia was not an empty space waiting to be conquered. It was a lived landscape. And when railway planners looked across their maps, those different realities were often reduced to lines, measurements, gradients, and projected costs. That is one of the strange things about great infrastructure. On paper, it can appear almost peaceful. A ruler, a straight line, a number indicating miles, a river marked by blue ink. But the land represented by that paper may contain villages, forests, sacred places, farms, migration routes, burial grounds, animals, swamps, cliffs, and human lives. The future Trans-Siberian Railway began in this distance between the map and the world. During the 19th century, proposals for Siberian railways appeared repeatedly. Different routes were discussed. Local interests competed. Merchants wanted access. Military officials thought about security. Government ministries worried about cost. Engineers considered gradients and river crossings. Some proposals seemed premature. Others appeared financially impossible. For a time, the very scale of the idea helped delay it. A railway across Siberia was easy to imagine in principle. It was much harder to decide where it should go, who should pay for it, how quickly it should be built, and whether the empire truly possessed the resources to finish it. But the world was changing around Russia. Railway networks were expanding elsewhere. Industrial power was becoming increasingly connected with transport. The Pacific region was growing in strategic importance. Russian officials understood that the Far East could not remain indefinitely dependent upon slow and uncertain links with the western heart of the empire. And gradually, the question changed. It was no longer simply, should Russia build a railway across Siberia? It became, how long could Russia afford not to? By the final decades of the 19th century, the old relationship between distance and empire was becoming intolerable. A territory spanning much of northern Eurasia could not function efficiently if people and goods still traveled across its interior at the speed of horses. The railway promised something almost magical. Predictability. A train could carry far more than a wagon. It could move in winter. It could follow a timetable. It could transport settlers and equipment east, then bring timber, grain, minerals, and other goods west. It could carry officials, soldiers, engineers, mail, and machinery. It could turn weeks into days, months into weeks, and places that had seemed unimaginably remote could become stops on a schedule. Perhaps this was the deepest attraction of the railway. It promised to make Siberia measurable. A wilderness that had once been described through journeys could be described through stations. Instead of saying that one settlement lay many exhausting days beyond another, people could eventually say that a train arrived there at a certain hour. Distance would still exist. The cold would still exist. The forests and rivers would still be immense. But the railway would introduce a thin mechanical rhythm into the landscape. Steel, steam, timetables, signals. At first, however, there was only imagination. Picture a government office in Saint Petersburg during a winter evening. Outside, snow settles on roofs and carriage wheels. Inside, lamps glow over a wooden table. A large map of the empire has been unfolded. The paper is covered with rivers, towns, administrative borders, mountain ranges, and vast areas that seem almost empty. Someone places a hand near the Ural Mountains. Another person traces a finger eastward, across the Ob, across the Yenisei, toward Irkutsk, toward Lake Baikal, then farther still, toward the Amur country, toward Vladivostok. The finger travels quickly, a few seconds. The real journey might take months. This was the illusion that every railway planner had to overcome. On paper, Siberia could be crossed in one movement of the hand. On the ground, every inch of that movement would demand labor. Trees would need to fall. Earth would need to move. Bridges would need to rise. Food would need to arrive. Men would fall ill. Tools would break. Floods would destroy work. Winter would stop machinery. Money would disappear faster than expected. And still, the rails would have to continue. By the end of the 1880s, the idea had gathered enough political weight that it could no longer remain a collection of proposals. The Russian state was moving toward a decision of extraordinary consequence. Under Emperor Alexander III, the government increasingly embraced the construction of what would become known as the Great Siberian Railway. In 1891, the imperial commitment became unmistakable. That year, on the Pacific coast at Vladivostok, the future Emperor Nicholas II, then the heir to the throne, participated in ceremonies connected with the beginning of the Great Eastern Railway project. The symbolism was powerful. At one end stood European Russia, the old political and economic heart of the empire. At the other stood the Pacific. Between them lay thousands of miles of rivers, forests, villages, mountains, plains, snow, and silence. The dream was no longer merely to travel through that distance. The dream was to bind it together. Soon, surveyors would enter the landscape. Construction camps would appear. Axes would strike trees. Shovels would cut into frozen and muddy ground. Rails would begin moving eastward and westward toward one another. And across a continent that had long followed the slow rhythms of horses, rivers, seasons, and human endurance, another sound was about to begin. The ringing of hammers against iron. Before the railway became a physical object, it existed as an argument. It lived in reports, in engineering memoranda, in financial calculations, in military assessments, in the margins of maps, and in rooms where men wearing dark uniforms and formal coats leaned over tables beneath the soft light of oil lamps. To build a railway across Siberia was to attempt something that seemed at once logical and almost absurd. The logic was easy to understand. Russia needed a faster route to the Pacific. It needed a stronger connection with Siberia. It needed to move settlers, goods, officials, soldiers, machinery, and mail across its enormous territory. But the absurdity was equally obvious. The proposed railway would have to cross a region so vast that even estimating its true cost was difficult. No single railway company could easily finance such a project. Private investors naturally preferred routes where passengers and freight already existed in large numbers. Siberia offered something different. It offered potential, and potential was much harder to place into an accounting book. In the government ministries of Saint Petersburg, the railway therefore became more than a transport project. It became a question about the future of the empire itself. What was Siberia supposed to become? Was it primarily a distant military frontier, a place of exile, a source of raw materials, a destination for peasants seeking land, a commercial bridge between Europe and Asia? Or could it become all of those things at once? The answer depended, to a remarkable degree, on whether people could move through it. By the late 19th century, railways had transformed ideas about state power. A government connected by rail could react more quickly. A merchant connected by rail could reach larger markets. A farmer near a railway could sell grain farther away. A military unit could travel in days across distances that once required weeks of marching. A letter could continue its journey from a railway station with far greater speed than from an isolated postal road. The railway was not merely transportation. It was compression. It compressed space. It compressed time. And for an empire defined by vast distances, that promise was irresistible. Among those who understood the political importance of railway construction was Sergei Witte, one of the most influential Russian statesmen of the period. Witte had practical experience with railways before rising to the highest levels of imperial government. He understood that railroads were not passive lines laid across the landscape. They could reshape economies. They could change where people settled. They could alter the balance between regions. And they could strengthen the ability of the central state to reach distant territory. When Witte became Minister of Finance in the early 1890s, the Siberian Railway project gained one of its most determined supporters. For Witte and others around him, the railway was part of a much larger vision. Russia was industrializing. Factories were expanding. Coal and iron production were growing. Cities were changing. Foreign investment was entering the empire. The state was trying to modernize infrastructure without surrendering political control. In this world, the Trans-Siberian Railway could become both a symbol and an instrument of modernization. But even supporters knew the project could not be treated like an ordinary railway. The distances were too great. The population was too unevenly distributed. The landscape was too difficult. The construction would need to be coordinated over thousands of miles. And so the government adopted an approach that reflected the scale of the challenge. Rather than beginning at one point and slowly pushing in a single direction, construction would proceed on several major sections. Work could advance simultaneously from different regions. The western sections could extend deeper into Siberia, while eastern sections pushed inland from the Pacific. Eventually, the separate pieces would meet. In theory, this saved time. In practice, it created another problem. Each construction zone became its own small world. Each required surveyors, engineers, laborers, food, tools, timber, explosives, steel, medical supplies, horses, temporary buildings, administrative staff, money, and all of these had to move into places where transportation was already poor. The railway was being built partly to solve the problem of Siberian transport. Yet, until it was built, its own construction remained trapped by that very problem. This paradox followed the project from the beginning. Engineers would often have to transport materials along the same primitive routes the railway was intended to replace. Heavy rails might arrive by river. Machinery could be hauled over difficult roads. Bridge components could travel enormous distances before reaching the site where they were needed. Sometimes supplies arrived late. Sometimes the wrong materials arrived. Sometimes weather delayed everything. A construction schedule written in Saint Petersburg could look neat and precise. A Siberian spring had no obligation to respect it. Still, on official maps, the line began to take shape. One important western route would run from the region of Chelyabinsk, near the edge of European Russia, eastward toward the great rivers and cities of western Siberia. From there, it would continue through areas associated with Omsk and toward the Yenisei. Farther east lay Irkutsk. Beyond Irkutsk stood one of the greatest natural obstacles of the entire project, Lake Baikal. Beyond the lake, the railway would continue toward Transbaikalia and the distant eastern territories. In the Far East, construction would also begin from Vladivostok. Eventually, all of these lines were supposed to form a continuous chain, a single railway across the continent. But a map can make difficult things look easy. Imagine a young engineer seeing the route for the first time. His education has taught him how to calculate gradients. He understands bridges. He can measure curves. He knows how locomotives behave on inclines. He has studied drainage, embankments, track construction, and the strength of materials. Then someone places a map of Siberia before him. The familiar symbols are there. Rivers, mountains, town names, distances. But between those symbols lie enormous spaces. He runs his finger eastward. Chelyabinsk, Omsk, the Ob River, the Yenisei, Krasnoyarsk, Irkutsk, Lake Baikal, Shita, the Amur region, Vladivostok. Today, many of these names are immediately associated with railway stations and established cities. At the beginning of the project, their relationship with one another felt very different. The railway line between them did not exist. Each name was almost an island. Between them were roads, river routes, forests, settlements, and wilderness. The engineer could see the planned line, but he could not yet hear it. There were no locomotives moving through the Taiga, no whistles echoing across frozen rivers, no station clocks, no porters, no waiting rooms filled with steam and wet coats. There was only a line of ink. One of the most difficult tasks was deciding exactly where that line should go. Railways cannot simply move in perfect straight lines from one city to another. Locomotives care about slopes. Builders care about soil. Bridges care about riverbanks. Budgets care about distance. Local officials care about whether the railway passes through their region. Merchants care about access to markets. Military planners care about strategic routes. Every possible alignment created winners and losers. A town placed directly on the railway might experience rapid growth. A town bypassed by several dozen miles could find itself suddenly less important. In some cases, entirely new communities would emerge because engineers selected one location rather than another. This meant that surveying was not merely technical. It was political, economic, and deeply human. Survey teams moved ahead of construction, examining land that few railway specialists had ever seen. Their work could be monotonous. It could also be dangerous. They measured elevations, marked possible routes, studied river crossings, examined soil, looked for timber, estimated the difficulty of cuttings and embankments. They had to think not only about summer conditions, but about what would happen when winter arrived. A shallow depression in August could become a trap for drifting snow in January. A quiet stream could become violent during spring thaw. Ground that seemed stable while frozen could soften dramatically when temperatures rose. The Siberian landscape changed character with the seasons. The railway would have to survive all of them. Cost remained a constant concern. The imperial government wanted the line built quickly, but every additional bridge, tunnel, detour, or heavy structure increased the expense. This created pressure to build economically. Some early sections were constructed to relatively light standards. Curves could be sharper than ideal. Rails could be lighter. Earthworks could be narrower. Temporary structures might later need replacement. This was not unusual for a pioneering railway. The first goal was connection. Perfection could come later. But such choices had consequences. A railway designed quickly and economically might struggle as traffic increased. Weak bridges needed strengthening. Light rails needed replacement. Curves limited speed. Single-track sections created bottlenecks. In a sense, the Trans-Siberian Railway began aging before it was finished. The moment one section opened, planners were already thinking about how it might someday need improvement. Yet, in the early 1890s, improvement was a distant problem. First, there had to be a railway at all. The formal beginning of construction carried enormous symbolism. In 1891, at Vladivostok, ceremonies marked the start of the eastern section of the Great Railway. The heir to the throne, Nicholas Alexandrovich, the future Nicholas II, had traveled through Asia and arrived in the Russian Far East. His presence transformed an engineering event into an imperial statement. The message was clear. The railway was not merely a regional project. It belonged to the future of the empire. From the Pacific end, workers would begin pushing westward. From the western side of Siberia, other teams would push eastward. The continent would be approached from both directions. There was something almost theatrical about the vision. Two movements of iron advancing towards one another across thousands of miles. Yet the reality of construction would be far less elegant. Official ceremonies might include uniforms, speeches, polished tools, flags, and dignitaries. The actual work began with dirt. Earth had to be moved. Forests had to be cut. Swamps had to be filled. Temporary camps had to be built. Food had to be cooked. Animals had to be cared for. Thousands of workers had to be recruited and sent east. Most of them would never see the rooms where the railway had been planned. They would know the project not as an imperial vision, but as a shovel handle, a blister, a bowl of soup, a wet blanket, a frozen boot, a payday, a missing letter from home. This difference between the imagined railway and the lived railway is central to its story. For the government, the line represented strategy. For financiers, it represented expense and opportunity. For engineers, it represented technical challenge. For settlers, it might represent land. For merchants, it meant markets. For a laborer standing ankle-deep in Siberian mud, it could mean simply another day of work before darkness. Yet all of these experiences belonged to the same railway. Construction expanded rapidly. The western Siberian section pushed from Chelyabinsk toward Omsk and beyond. This area contained broad plains, major rivers, and long distances where gradients were more manageable than in some eastern regions. But easier did not mean easy. The climate remained severe. Rivers still required major bridges. Supplies still traveled slowly. Workers still lived under rough conditions. One of the greatest early challenges involved crossing the Ob River near the settlement that would eventually become Novosibirsk. Before the railway, there was no great modern city there. The selection of the crossing point changed the destiny of the area. Engineers needed a location suitable for a major bridge. Around the construction site grew a settlement associated with the railway. It would expand dramatically in the decades to come. Today, Novosibirsk is one of Russia's largest cities. Its rise is almost impossible to separate from the arrival of the Trans-Siberian Railway. This pattern would repeat itself across Siberia. The railway did not merely connect cities. Sometimes it created them. Farther east, planners confronted the Yenisei River near Krasnoyarsk. Again, a railway line approaching an enormous Siberian river had to pause and solve a problem that could not be negotiated away. A train cannot politely ask a river to move. A bridge had to be designed. Foundations had to survive currents and ice. Materials had to reach the site. Construction had to proceed through extreme seasonal changes. The bridge across the Yenisei would eventually become one of the great engineering achievements associated with the railway. But before it became a finished structure, it was a series of calculations and incomplete supports standing in cold water. Every great bridge begins this way, not as a bridge, as separate pieces. A foundation on one bank, materials piled nearby, temporary structures, scaffolding, men shouting instructions over the sound of water. Then, slowly, two sides of the landscape are joined. Meanwhile, the eastern sections were developing under very different conditions. The Far East presented its own combination of mountains, rivers, forests, thin settlement, and difficult supply routes. Vladivostok was connected to the sea, which gave builders an important advantage. Materials could arrive by ship. But once construction moved inland, the familiar problem returned. Every new mile pushed crews farther from established supply points. Railway construction therefore became a moving frontier. Behind the front came completed track. At the front was unfinished earth. Ahead was wilderness. One could almost measure progress by sound. Behind the workers, locomotives might eventually begin moving. Closer to the construction camps came wagons carrying rails and supplies. At the leading edge, the noise of machinery faded. Then there was only the sound of axes in trees, shovels striking soil, horses pulling loads, men calling to one another, and beyond them, silence. The government understood that this enormous effort required centralized coordination. A special committee was established to oversee the Siberian Railway and the development connected with it. The project was not regarded simply as a line of rails. Officials discussed roads feeding into the railway, migration, agriculture, trade, settlement, river transport, even the broader transformation of Siberia. This was one of the most ambitious aspects of the plan. The railway was expected to produce its own world. New villages would arise around stations. Farmers would send grain to distant markets. Merchants would build warehouses. Postal services would accelerate. Factories might appear where there had previously been only workshops. The state hoped people would move east and cultivate land. Economic activity would justify the railway. The railway would stimulate more economic activity. It was a circle of development, at least in theory. But history rarely unfolds as neatly as planning documents suggest. Siberia was not empty. Indigenous communities already inhabited vast regions. Older Russian settlements had existing economies based on rivers and traditional routes. A railway could bring opportunity while also disturbing older patterns of life. New settlement meant new pressure on land. Markets could enrich some communities while weakening others. Towns favored by railway geography might grow rapidly, while older settlements away from the tracks declined. Modernization created movement. Movement created disruption. These consequences were not always visible to officials looking at maps in St. Petersburg. What they could see more clearly was the strategic map. East Asia was changing. China, Japan, Britain, and other powers all had interests in the region. Ports, railways, trade routes, and military access were becoming central to imperial competition. Russia's hold on the Far East could not depend indefinitely on geography alone. A flag planted on the Pacific coast was useful. A railway connecting that coast with the imperial heartland was something far more powerful. This strategic reasoning would eventually help push the railway beyond the straightforward idea of a route entirely through Russian territory. Planners considered ways to shorten the journey by crossing Manchuria in northeastern China. That decision would later produce the Chinese Eastern Railway and introduce new layers of diplomacy, commerce, and geopolitical risk. But in the early phase of the project, the most urgent question remained construction. Could the tracks actually be laid fast enough? Could labor be found? Could the government continue paying for it? Could bridges be finished before floods damaged unfinished work? Could the railway move deeper into a territory where its own success had to create the conditions necessary for further success? Every year brought new stretches of track, and every stretch of completed line changed the logistics of the next. Once rails reached a construction zone, locomotives could carry heavier loads closer to the front. The railway began building itself. Steel rails carried new steel rails. Trains carried sleepers. Machinery traveled over track that had not existed the year before. Construction camps moved forward. Stations appeared behind them. Maps were revised. Distances that had once required horses could now be covered by rail. And the imagination of the project began to change. At first, the Trans-Siberian Railway had been an enormous promise. Then parts of it became real. A traveler could board a train and ride eastward farther than before. He would eventually reach the end of the completed track. There, perhaps, the railway stopped abruptly. Beyond the final rails lay wagons, temporary roads, construction camps, forests, and the unfinished future. This edge of the railway must have been a strange place. Behind you stood the industrial world. Locomotives, telegraph wires, schedules, steel, Ahead of you stood land still waiting for survey stakes and earthworks. The frontier was not a wall. It was the final pair of rails. And every day, that frontier moved. In St. Petersburg, officials watched numbers. Miles completed. Money spent. Bridges under construction. Workers employed. Projected dates. But thousands of miles away, progress looked different. A tree falling in the forest. A slope being cut by hand. A wagon of soil tipping onto an embankment. A carpenter building a temporary barracks. A cook stirring a pot for exhausted men. An engineer checking a level for the third time. A laborer lifting one end of a wooden sleeper. Then another. Then another. The railway that had begun as a dream among rulers and ministers was leaving the world of paper. It was becoming physical, heavy, dirty, cold, human. And as the iron road advanced into Siberia, the men constructing it would discover that the greatest challenge was not imagining a line across nothingness. It was surviving long enough to place that line upon the ground. The maps had spoken. The orders had been signed. The money had begun to flow. Now the Taiga was waiting. The railway was conceived in offices, but it was built by hands. Hands that held axes. Hands that lifted timber. Hands that pulled ropes through mud. Hands that tightened bolts with fingers made stiff by cold. Hands that shook from exhaustion at the end of a 14-hour day. As construction spread eastward and westward across Siberia, the great imperial project entered a different world. No longer was it mainly about ministers, budgets, and lines on maps. It became a story of camps, of fires, of shovels, of blisters, of men sleeping beneath rough blankets while the wind pressed against the walls of wooden barracks. The workers came from many backgrounds. Some were peasants looking for wages. Some were seasonal laborers who had already worked on roads, canals, or other railway projects. Some were skilled craftsmen. There were carpenters, blacksmiths, mechanics, bridge workers, and stone cutters. There were soldiers assigned to construction duties. There were convicts and exiles used as labor in certain areas. There were local people hired along the route. There were migrants who arrived hoping the railway might lead them toward a new life. And there were young engineers, often educated far from Siberia, who suddenly found themselves responsible for construction crews in landscapes they had previously known only from maps. Together, they formed a moving society along the edge of the railway. It was temporary, improvised, often uncomfortable, and always moving. A camp might exist beside a river for one season. Then the bridge was completed. The workers packed what they could. The equipment moved forward. A few buildings might remain. Perhaps a station would eventually grow there. Perhaps a settlement. Or perhaps the forest would quietly reclaim the site. The rhythm of railway construction depended heavily on the seasons. Siberia did not offer one kind of difficulty. It offered several, arranged across the year. Winter was the most obvious. Temperatures could fall far below freezing. Metal became painfully cold to touch. Wood cracked. Snow covered survey markers. Water for men and animals had to be obtained through ice. Machinery became harder to operate. Oil thickened. Tools behaved differently. A careless worker could lose feeling in his fingers. A tired man who became wet could be in danger very quickly. Yet winter also had advantages. Frozen ground could support heavy loads where summer mud could not. Swamps hardened. Rivers became roads of ice. Some transport actually became easier when the landscape froze solid. Then came spring, and spring could be worse. The snow softened. The rivers began to move. Ice broke apart with tremendous force. Water rose. Roads disappeared into mud. Ground that had seemed permanent became unstable. Wagons sank. Horses struggled. Embankments washed away. Temporary bridges were threatened by floodwaters and drifting ice. A construction crew could spend weeks building something, only to watch part of it collapse under the violence of thaw. Summer brought warmth. It also brought mosquitoes. Millions of them. In the great wet spaces of Siberia, insects could become an almost constant presence. Men worked with faces swollen from bites. Smoke from small fires was sometimes used to drive insects away. Mud remained a problem in low ground. Rain could turn camps into brown fields of water and footprints. Food spoiled more easily. Illness spread. Then autumn arrived. Rain became colder. Days shortened. Workers rushed to finish earthworks and bridge foundations before another winter closed around them. In this cycle, the railway advanced. Mile by mile. Sleeper by sleeper. Rail by rail. Much of the work was physical in the most direct sense. Before track could be laid, the land had to be prepared. Trees had to be cleared. Stumps had to be removed. Uneven ground had to be cut down or filled. Drainage ditches had to be dug. Earth had to be shaped into an embankment strong enough to support locomotives and freight. Today, when people imagine railway construction, they may picture large machines moving enormous quantities of earth. In the 1890s, much of the work depended on human labor, horses, carts, wheelbarrows, hand tools, and relatively simple mechanical equipment. Picture a line of men beside a shallow cutting. One swings a pick into the soil. Another uses a shovel. Earth is loaded into a cart. A horse pulls the cart toward the embankment. The soil is dumped. Then the cart returns. Again. 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 Nothing about a finished railway reveals how repetitive its construction could be. A passenger later sees a smooth track disappearing toward the horizon. The laborer saw the same few yards of ground for hours. A mound. A trench. A row of sleepers. A pile of stones. Progress was often measured in small movements repeated thousands of times. The wooden sleepers beneath the rails were placed by hand. Steel rails arrived in long, heavy sections. Groups of men carried and positioned them. Fastenings had to be driven. Gauge had to be checked. Alignment corrected. Ballast placed. Everything had to be close enough to specification that a locomotive weighing many tons could eventually pass over it without leaving the track. The physical effort was enormous, and it was not enough simply to build quickly. A mistake hidden beneath the track might reveal itself later under a train. An embankment that had not settled properly could shift. Poor drainage could soften the roadbed. A badly aligned curve could increase the risk of derailment. A weak temporary bridge might fail under heavier traffic. The railway demanded speed, but it also punished carelessness. This placed engineers in an uncomfortable position. Many were young. Some had excellent technical education but limited experience with the extreme conditions of Siberia. They were responsible for keeping construction moving while dealing with shortages, weather, accidents, sick workers, damaged equipment, incomplete information, and orders from superiors far away. An engineer might begin his day by checking a bridge foundation. Then he might inspect an embankment damaged by rain. After that, a supply wagon failed to arrive. A foreman complained that 20 men were ill. A horse had broken a leg. A shipment of rails was delayed. Someone had misread a survey measurement. By evening, the engineer sat in a rough cabin beneath a lamp, writing reports about progress. On paper, perhaps the language remained calm. Construction proceeding. Materials required. Additional labor requested. Delay due to weather. But behind those simple phrases were entire days of difficulty. For ordinary workers, life could be even harsher. Housing varied greatly. Some lived in barracks. Others slept in temporary huts, tents, or wooden structures built near the work. The quality of shelter depended on the location, the season, and the organization of the construction section. A good camp might contain a kitchen, storage buildings, a small medical station, stables, and sleeping quarters. A poor one might offer little more than a roof and a stove. At night, damp clothing hung near fires. Boots were placed close to heat. Men slept on bunks or simple bedding. The air inside could become heavy with smoke, sweat, wet wool, tobacco, and the smell of cooking. Outside, the forest stood in darkness. Food was basic. Bread was essential. So were grains, soup, potatoes when available, fish, meat, onions, tea, and whatever could be supplied locally or transported to the camp. A hot drink could become one of the most important comforts of the day. The samovar, already deeply familiar in Russian life, belonged naturally in such a world. Steam rising from hot tea. Hands wrapped around a cup. A few minutes near a stove. Then back outside. Alcohol was also part of working life, especially vodka, although its role could be complicated. For some men, it was warmth, relief, or habit. For supervisors, it could become a disciplinary problem. In isolated camps where entertainment was limited and exhaustion constant, drinking could lead to fights, lost work, or accidents. The railway camp was not a romantic frontier. It was a place where people became tired. And tired people sometimes made dangerous decisions. Accidents were part of construction. A tree could fall in the wrong direction. A horse could panic. A cart could overturn. Rock could collapse from a cutting. Explosives could misfire. A worker could slip from temporary scaffolding. A heavy rail could crush a hand or foot. Illness could be just as dangerous as injury. Medical care in remote camps was limited. Doctors and medical assistants worked along some sections, but the railway stretched across such enormous distances that help was not always close. A fever could become serious. An infected wound could worsen. Poor sanitation could turn one case of sickness into many. The empire was building one of the most modern forms of transportation in the world, with workers who often lived under extremely primitive conditions. There was a striking contrast in that. Steel rails represented the future. The construction camp could feel ancient. Firewood, mud, horses, hand tools, darkness after sunset. Letters from home mattered enormously. A worker might have traveled hundreds or thousands of miles for employment. His family could be somewhere west of the Urals. A wife might be waiting in a village. Parents might depend on the money he sent home. Children might grow for months without seeing him. When mail reached the camp, ordinary paper could become more valuable than food. A letter carried familiar handwriting into the wilderness. News of a birth, a sickness, a wedding, a harvest, a death, a request for money, a promise to return. Imagine one worker sitting beside the wall of a barracks after the others have begun sleeping. A small lamp burns near him. He has a piece of paper. Perhaps he writes slowly. Perhaps his handwriting is rough. He tells his family that work is difficult. He says he is healthy, even if he is not. He describes the cold. He says wages should be paid soon. He promises to send money. Then he folds the paper. How long will it take to reach them? He cannot know. Around him, men cough in their sleep. Outside, snow falls over unfinished track. Not every worker was there by free choice. The use of convicts and prisoners belongs to the darker side of the railway's human story. Siberia had long been integrated into the imperial penal system. Prisoners and exiles were already present throughout the region, and convict labor was used in connection with railway construction in certain places, particularly in eastern sections. Their conditions could be severe. Hard labor, restricted movement, guards, punishment, poor shelter, limited control over their own lives. For these men, the railway did not represent opportunity. It represented another form of compulsion. The irony was difficult to miss. A railway celebrated as a symbol of movement and connection was partly built by people whose freedom of movement had been taken away. Their names were rarely preserved. Official photographs might show construction crews. Reports might record numbers. But numbers flatten people. 300 workers, 500 convicts, 1,000 laborers. Behind each number was someone with a face, a memory, a fear, perhaps a family, perhaps a crime, perhaps a political conviction, perhaps simply bad luck. Great infrastructure often produces this problem in history. The object survives. The people disappear. The bridge still stands. The station still has a name. The worker becomes a statistic. Yet without those statistics, there would have been no railway. The same was true of local populations. The line crossed lands inhabited by many different communities, including indigenous Siberian peoples, whose lives had long been shaped by rivers, forests, hunting grounds, grazing areas, and seasonal movement. Railway construction changed access to land. It brought new settlers, new markets, new officials, new diseases, new pressures. The same locomotive that represented opportunity to one family could represent disruption to another. The Iron Road was not neutral. Nothing that reorganizes a continent is neutral. Still, for many migrants, the railway became a path toward possibility. As sections opened, workers sometimes remained nearby. Small settlements formed around stations and depots. A carpenter who had arrived to build a bridge might later find work maintaining railway buildings. A blacksmith might open a workshop. A laborer might become a porter. A cook might establish an eating house. Men who came to build the railway could become part of the society growing around it. The construction frontier gradually turned into a settlement frontier. At the very edge of completed track, however, life remained raw. There was an unusual experience known only to people who worked close to the advancing end of the railway. Behind them lay a world increasingly connected to Europe by steel. Ahead lay forest. The locomotive could carry supplies almost to the edge. Then everything changed. Rails ended. Freight had to be unloaded. Wagons carried materials farther. Men dragged equipment into terrain where the railway itself did not yet exist. Day by day, the last station moved deeper into Siberia. A telegraph line often followed or accompanied railway development, adding another remarkable transformation. A place that had once been isolated could suddenly communicate with distant offices. Messages moved faster than people. Engineers could request materials. Officials could report delays. News could travel along wires above the track. The railway carried bodies and goods. The telegraph carried information. Together they changed the scale of the empire. But for the man holding a shovel, these technologies did not necessarily make the work easier. He still had to lift the earth. There is something almost impossible to understand about the cumulative labor required. One sleeper seems manageable. One rail can be imagined. One ditch can be dug. One tree can be cut. But the Trans-Siberian Railway demanded these actions over and over across thousands of miles. That repetition is where its true scale lives. Not in one spectacular moment. In ordinary effort multiplied almost beyond comprehension. A worker bends, lifts, carries, places, straightens. The next worker follows, then another. The line advances several yards. Tomorrow they do it again. In rain, in heat, in insects, in snow. The grand language of empire disappears here. There is no need to speak of destiny, only work. As the years passed, completed segments began carrying trains. This must have created a strange psychological effect for construction crews. A locomotive approaching from behind could bring food, tools, rails, letters, and replacement workers. Its whistle echoed through areas where, not long before, no railway sound had ever existed. For the men farther ahead, that whistle meant the industrial world was catching up with them. Soon, track would reach their present camp. Then the camp would move again. In this way, the workers were always leaving civilization behind and then building it under their own feet. The landscape changed slowly. Trees were cut. A straight embankment crossed a field. Telegraph poles appeared. A water tower rose. A station building was painted. Smoke from a locomotive drifted above the forest. And then something extraordinary happened. The railway began to look permanent. A traveler arriving only a few years later might never know how temporary and fragile everything had once been. He would see rails. He would see schedules. He would see station signs. He might complain about delays or uncomfortable seats. He would not see the camp that had stood there. He would not smell wet wool drying over a stove. He would not hear workers arguing about missing wages. He would not see the man whose hand had been crushed beneath a rail. He would not know who dug the drainage ditch beside the track. The railway concealed its own construction. That is why it is worth imagining those forgotten scenes. A blacksmith at night. His forge glows orange. Outside, the cold is severe. Inside, sparks rise into darkness as he repairs a tool needed in the morning. A group of laborers drag a rail through mud. Their boots sink. Someone curses. Someone laughs. Someone loses his grip. They stop. Then begin again. An engineer stands beside a half-finished embankment after rain. He knows part of it will have to be rebuilt. He says nothing for a moment. A prisoner under guard looks into the forest. He can hear hammering beyond the trees. A cook wakes before everyone else and begins heating water. A young worker receives a letter and reads it 3 times. A horse stands beneath snow with steam rising from its body. And somewhere far behind them, in a warm office, another section of the route is colored onto a map. Progress. The word looks clean. The reality was mud, and blood, and smoke, and fatigue. Yet the rails continued. Eastward, across western Siberia, toward the great rivers, toward Krasnoyarsk, toward Irkutsk, toward the mountains and the deep blue silence of Baikal. Every completed mile was a small victory over distance, but the land ahead was becoming more difficult. The broad plains would give way to harsher engineering problems. There would be larger bridges, more complicated terrain, unstable ground, ice, floods, rock, and eventually a lake so vast that the railway could not simply cross it. For now, however, the workers kept moving. One evening, after another day of construction, imagine standing at the end of the unfinished line. Behind you, twin rails stretch back into the distance. They shine faintly beneath the last light. Ahead, nothing has been built. The forest begins only a short distance away. There is no station, no signal, no timetable, just trees and silence. Tomorrow the men will clear another section, then another. The rails will advance. The silence will move farther east. And Siberia, almost without noticing, will begin to hear the sound of iron. A railway looks simple from a distance. 2 lines of steel, wooden sleepers beneath them, a train moving steadily toward the horizon. But beneath those rails lies an entire hidden world of decisions. How high should the embankment be? Where should water drain? How steep can the gradient become before a locomotive begins to struggle? Where should a bridge cross a river? How deep must its foundations go? What happens when winter freezes the ground? What happens when spring melts it again? And what happens when an entire river begins carrying broken ice downstream with enough force to tear apart badly designed supports? Across Siberia, these questions were not occasional problems. They were the railway. Distance had been the first enemy. Terrain became the second. In western Siberia, the builders encountered broad plains that could appear deceptively gentle. From a railway engineer's point of view, level country could be attractive. Fewer steep gradients. Fewer deep cuttings. Less need for tunnels. But flat land brought its own difficulties. Water had nowhere to go. During spring thaw, enormous areas could become saturated. Roadbeds softened. Ditches filled. Low ground turned into swamp. An embankment that seemed stable during winter could begin to sink when the earth thawed beneath it. The engineers quickly learned that a railway was not simply laid upon the landscape. It had to understand the landscape. Drainage became essential. Culverts had to carry streams beneath the track. Ditches guided snowmelt away from embankments. Low areas were filled. Soft ground had to be strengthened. In some places, timber and layers of earth were used to create a more stable foundation. The work rarely looked dramatic. A drainage channel does not inspire the same admiration as a great iron bridge. But a railway without drainage could fail quietly. The track would sag. Rails would move out of alignment. A locomotive passing at speed could become dangerous. Some of the most important engineering decisions were therefore almost invisible. The builders had to pay attention to water even when no great river was nearby. And then came the rivers themselves. Siberia is crossed by some of the largest river systems in the world. They are not minor features on the landscape. They divide it. In summer, they become wide, moving expanses of water. In winter, they freeze beneath snow. Then spring arrives. The ice breaks. Huge sheets begin to shift. Pressure builds against riverbanks and structures. Chunks of ice can strike bridge piers with terrible force. Water rises. Debris moves downstream. For railway planners, every major river demanded a separate solution. A bridge could not simply be copied from another location. The width was different. The riverbed was different. The speed of the current was different. The seasonal behavior of the ice was different. Even the banks could change from year to year. Before construction began, engineers studied possible crossing points carefully. A shorter crossing could reduce cost. But a narrow point with poor foundations might prove more dangerous than a wider section with better ground. An approach that looked convenient on one bank might create difficult gradients on the other. The bridge had to fit not only the river, but the railway approaching it from both directions. One of the most important early crossings was the Ob River. The railway approached the river in western Siberia, and engineers had to choose a location for a permanent bridge. The site they selected would do more than solve a technical problem. It would help create a city. Near the crossing, a railway settlement grew rapidly. It was first known by names connected with the imperial family and the new bridge. In time, it became Novosibirsk. The future city grew because iron and geography met at that point. Before the bridge, the river had been an obstacle. After the bridge, the crossing became a center of movement. This pattern reveals one of the strange powers of railway engineering. A bridge does not only connect two banks, it can reorganize the human landscape around it. Warehouses appear, workers settle, markets develop, roads lead toward the station. A town becomes important because trains must pass through it. The river that once separated people begins attracting them. Building the Ob crossing demanded large quantities of material and disciplined coordination. Foundations had to be established in difficult conditions. Temporary works had to survive water and weather. Steel components had to arrive from industrial centers far away. Every piece represented a long chain of production and transport. Someone had manufactured the metal. Someone had loaded it. Someone had moved it east. Someone had unloaded it. Someone had counted it. Someone had protected it from damage. Only then could bridge builders lift it into position. The finished bridge looked unified. Its construction was anything but. Farther east stood another giant, the Yenisei. Near Krasnoyarsk, the river presented one of the most impressive engineering problems on the route. The bridge built there became famous, not simply because it crossed a large river, but because it represented the growing technical confidence of Russian railway engineering. The Yenisei Bridge used substantial metal spans supported by strong masonry piers. Its proportions gave it a severe beauty. Dark steel above cold-moving water. Heavy supports rising from the river. Rails passing over a landscape that had once forced travelers to stop and wait. Imagine approaching such a construction site before the bridge was complete. There is no graceful finished structure. There are isolated piers, temporary scaffolding, cranes and lifting devices, stacks of material, barges, timber platforms, men shouting across the sound of the river. Steam equipment hisses. Hammers ring. The water continues beneath all of it, indifferent. A bridge is created in fragments. One support at a time, one span at a time. And for much of its construction, it looks less like a bridge than a collection of unfinished ideas standing in water. Then a moment arrives when the spans connect. The gap is closed. Rails are laid, and something that had divided the continent becomes a passage. The first train over a major bridge must have seemed almost impossible to those who had watched it being built. A locomotive approaches slowly. Its weight transfers onto the structure. Steel vibrates. Smoke drifts over the river. Men watch. The train continues. Nothing collapses. The river passes beneath it. Then the locomotive reaches the opposite bank. A crossing that once required boats, ferries, winter ice, or long delays has become part of a timetable. This is one of the quiet miracles of engineering. Not that the river disappears, but that the difficulty becomes routine. Future passengers may barely look out of the window. The bridge that consumed years of planning becomes a few minutes of travel. Yet Siberian rivers were only one kind of challenge. The farther east the railway advanced, the more varied the terrain became. The approaches to Lake Baikal and the lands beyond involved mountains, narrow valleys, rocky slopes, and more difficult gradients. Here, the dream of a simple line across a flat continent vanished completely. Railways preferred gentle slopes. Steel wheels have relatively little friction on steel rails. This makes trains efficient, but it also means locomotives cannot climb steep gradients easily. A road can turn sharply uphill. A railway must negotiate elevation more patiently. It curves. It cuts through ridges. It follows valleys. It climbs slowly. Every hill becomes a calculation. Too steep, and locomotives need additional power. Too sharp a curve, and speeds fall while mechanical wear increases. A shorter route over difficult ground might actually cost more to operate than a longer route with easier gradients. Surveyors therefore walked landscapes that locomotives had not yet entered, trying to imagine how a future train would move through them. They looked at a valley and saw not only beauty, but curvature. They looked at a mountain and saw excavation. They looked at a stream and saw a culvert. They looked at a cliff and saw cost. To build a railway is to learn to see land in a very particular way. The builders also had to learn the behavior of frozen ground. In parts of Siberia, winter frost penetrated deeply. Elsewhere, permanently frozen soils or complex seasonal freezing created additional difficulties. The ground was not always the solid foundation it appeared to be. Frozen earth can feel stronger than stone. Then heat arrives. Ice within the soil melts. The structure of the ground changes. The surface settles unevenly. A track that had been level can distort. This cycle of freezing and thawing creates movement. Railways dislike movement. The track must remain aligned. Bridges must remain stable. Drainage must function. Embankments must resist collapse. Engineers learned to use local materials and adapt their designs. They raised roadbeds where necessary. They improved drainage. They reinforced slopes. They watched areas that showed signs of instability. But knowledge often came from failure. A section might be built. Winter passed. Spring arrived. The track shifted. Then crews returned and repaired it. There was no single moment when Siberian engineering was solved. It was learned. Repeatedly. Sometimes expensively. Snow created another problem. A track can be perfectly engineered and still become useless if buried. In open country, wind gathered snow into deep drifts. Cuttings were especially vulnerable. Snow blown across the landscape could collect between their walls. A shallow depression became filled. Rails disappeared. Trains slowed or stopped. Workers were sent out with shovels. Later, more systematic snow protection was developed, including fences and planted barriers in some regions, but early railway operation often depended heavily on manual labor. Picture a winter morning after a storm. The railway is invisible. Only telegraph poles show where it should be. A group of men begins clearing. Shovels rise and fall. Snow is thrown aside. The men move slowly forward. Eventually, the dark lines of the rails appear. Hours later, perhaps, a locomotive approaches. The track is open again, until the next storm. Cold affected locomotives as well. Steam engines depended on water. In winter, everything involving water became difficult. Stations required reliable water supplies. Tanks and pipes had to be protected from freezing. Locomotives consumed large quantities of water and fuel. This is why water towers and fuel facilities became such important features of railway stations. A station was not merely a place for passengers. It was a service point for machines. A locomotive might arrive covered in frost and soot. Workers inspected it. Coal or wood was loaded, depending on local practice and supply. Water entered the tender. Mechanical parts were checked. Then the engine continued east. Each station extended the range of the railway. Without these repeated islands of fuel, water, repair, and shelter, the line could not function. In isolated regions, engineers had to think about where these facilities could be supplied. A water tower is useful only if there is water nearby. Fuel must come from somewhere. Workers need housing. Telegraph operators need stations. Maintenance crews need tools. Infrastructure creates the need for more infrastructure. The line became a chain of dependencies stretching across the continent. Even the telegraph poles beside the track had to survive Siberia. Wind, ice, falling trees, snow, rot, broken wires. A telegraph line that failed in a remote section could isolate stations from one another. Repair crews had to travel along the route, searching for the break. Imagine walking beside the tracks after a storm. The railway disappears behind you. Ahead, poles continue into a pale horizon. Somewhere, one wire has failed. The repairman must find where. This kind of work rarely enters heroic accounts of railway history. But the railway depended upon thousands of small acts of maintenance. A bridge is impressive. A signal cable is not. Yet one broken component can delay a train just as effectively as a collapsed bridge. As construction advanced, temporary solutions were often replaced by permanent ones. Early wooden bridges gave way to stronger structures. Lighter rails were upgraded. Embankments were reinforced. Stations were expanded. The first version of the Trans-Siberian Railway was not the final version. It was more like a living system. It grew. It adapted. It was strengthened as traffic increased. This happened partly because the original project had been pushed forward with extraordinary urgency. The empire wanted connection. Engineers sometimes had to accept compromises. A perfect railway built too slowly might fail the political purpose of the project. A less perfect railway completed sooner could be improved later. This tension between speed and permanence shaped many sections. It also created an unusual relationship with time. Some crews were building the future. Other crews, only a few hundred miles away, were already repairing the recent past. One section opened. Traffic increased. Weaknesses appeared. New crews arrived. Bridges were strengthened. Track was realigned. The railway was never simply finished. It was continually becoming. And the most difficult obstacles still lay ahead. Near Irkutsk, the line approached a body of water unlike anything else along the route. Lake Baikal. Deep. Ancient. Surrounded by mountains. During summer, it reflected the sky like a dark inland sea. During winter, much of its surface froze beneath a white silence. The lake stood directly across the desired route east. Engineers faced an uncomfortable fact. They could build across plains. They could bridge rivers. They could cut through hills. But Baikal was too large simply to bridge. A continuous railway around its rugged southern shore would require some of the most difficult and expensive construction on the entire Trans-Siberian system. Until that route existed, another solution would be necessary. The railway would have to stop. The train would have to surrender its passengers and freight to the lake. For an empire trying to create an unbroken iron road to the Pacific, this was an extraordinary interruption. West of Baikal, rails approached the water. East of Baikal, rails continued again. Between them lay a blue-black expanse of wind, ice, mountains, and uncertainty. The railway had reached a place where engineering could no longer pretend that the landscape was merely an obstacle to be crossed. For a time, it would have to negotiate. The locomotive would arrive at the shore. Steam would drift above the station. Passengers would step down. Freight would be transferred. And beyond the windows and platforms, Lake Baikal would wait. Silent. Immense. Unimpressed by the iron road that had crossed half a continent to reach it. There are places where a railway can persuade the landscape to cooperate. A river can be bridged. A forest can be cut. A hill can be crossed. A swamp can be drained. And then there are places where the landscape seems to answer with silence. Lake Baikal was such a place. When the Trans-Siberian Railway reached the country around Irkutsk, the builders had already crossed distances that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. Behind them lay the Ural Mountains, the plains of western Siberia, the Obi, the Yenisei, thousands of miles of new track. Stations had risen where there had once been little more than forest and riverbank. Locomotives now traveled through landscapes that had known only horses, carts, boats, and winter sledges. But east of Irkutsk, the railway encountered a barrier unlike any before it. Lake Baikal. To call Baikal a lake does not quite prepare the imagination for it. It is more than 400 miles long. In places, it is nearly 50 miles across. Mountains rise around it. Its waters descend to extraordinary depths. It contains more fresh water by volume than any other lake on Earth. And long before railway engineers arrived with surveying instruments and construction plans, Baikal had already existed for millions of years. The railway was young. The lake was ancient. That difference in scale seemed almost visible. Imagine approaching it near the end of the 19th century. The journey east from Irkutsk follows the Angara River toward the lake. The landscape begins to tighten. Mountains gather around the horizon. Air coming from the water feels colder. Then, through the trees, the surface appears. Blue in clear weather. Almost black beneath clouds. In winter, white and pale gray beneath snow and ice. The opposite shore can seem very far away. For travelers who had spent days listening to the regular sound of railway wheels, arrival at Baikal meant interruption. The rails could go no farther. Not yet. The Great Iron Road had reached an inland sea. The obvious solution was to build around it. But nothing about the southern shore of Lake Baikal was obvious. The most direct railway route would have to pass along steep rocky slopes where mountains descended toward the water. There were cliffs, narrow ledges, unstable rock, deep ravines, streams rushing from the mountains, very little flat land. A railway along this shore would require enormous amounts of excavation, tunnels, retaining walls, bridges, stone galleries, careful protection against falling rock. It would become one of the most demanding sections of the entire Siberian line, and it could not be completed immediately. The empire, therefore, needed a temporary answer. If rails could not yet go around Baikal, perhaps trains could cross it by water. This idea produced one of the most unusual chapters in railway history. A ferry large enough to carry railway cars would operate across the lake. Not an ordinary passenger steamer. A vessel designed as part ship, part railway infrastructure. A floating bridge between two unfinished ends of the Trans-Siberian route. The main vessel became known simply as the Baikal. She was an enormous ice-breaking railway ferry designed to transport passengers, freight, and railway cars across the lake. Her construction itself became a logistical adventure. The ship was built in Britain by the Armstrong Works at Newcastle. But carrying a completed vessel from Britain into the heart of Siberia was impossible. So the ferry was manufactured in sections. Those pieces traveled toward Russia and then deep into the interior, eventually reaching the Baikal region, where the vessel was assembled. It was an extraordinary reversal. A railway that did not yet fully cross Siberia was being used, along with older transport networks, to bring the pieces of a ship that would temporarily complete the railway. Steel traveled across Europe and Russia. Components were unloaded, moved again, carried toward the lake. Then, on the distant Siberian shore, shipbuilders reconstructed an icebreaker, piece by piece, rivet by rivet, until a vessel that had existed first in British drawings stood on the water of Baikal. The ferry entered service around the beginning of the 20th century. A second vessel, the Angara, also served the crossing, particularly in passenger and cargo duties. Together, these ships formed a strange marine link in what was supposed to be a continuous railway. At the western side, trains arrived near the lake. Passengers stepped down. Cargo was transferred. Railway cars could be taken aboard the large ferry. Then the vessel crossed toward the eastern shore, where the railway continued again. The experience must have felt unlike any other part of the journey. For days, passengers had surrendered themselves to the railway. There was a rhythm to train travel. The gentle swaying of a carriage. The repeated beat beneath the wheels. The whistle before a station. The hiss of steam. The sudden quiet when the train stopped. Then Baikal interrupted everything. The traveler left the carriage or watched it being moved aboard a ship. The smell changed. Coal smoke mixed with cold lake air. The sound of steel wheels gave way to water against the hull. Mountains surrounded the horizon. The railway had become a voyage. In summer, the crossing could be beautiful. Imagine a clear evening. The lake is nearly still. The mountains along the shore turn dark as the sun lowers. Smoke from the ferry stretches behind the vessel. A passenger stands near the rail with a heavy coat pulled around his shoulders. Behind him are railway cars. Ahead is open water. The sky slowly deepens from blue to violet. For a few hours, there are no telegraph poles passing the window. No forest rushing by. No rails. Only water. But Baikal's beauty could change quickly. The lake was famous for severe weather. Winds could rise suddenly. Waves could become dangerous. Fog could obscure the mountains. Temperatures could fall. And then there was winter. Winter transformed Baikal almost beyond recognition. As cold deepened across Siberia, the surface began to freeze. Ice spread outward. The open water narrowed. Eventually, enormous areas became solid. Snow fell across the frozen lake. From the shore, Baikal could appear less like water than a white plain extending toward the mountains. But ice is not silence made solid. It moves. It cracks. It expands. It contracts. It groans beneath changing temperatures. People standing on the frozen surface could sometimes hear deep sounds moving through it. Sharp reports. Long vibrations. A distant booming beneath the snow. The lake seemed to speak from below. Icebreakers were designed to force their way through such conditions. The Baikal had powerful machinery and a reinforced hull. She could break significant ice. But Siberian winter could still exceed machinery. Ice became too thick. Pressure ridges formed. Wind and movement piled broken sheets together. Progress slowed. A crossing that looked simple on a schedule could become a struggle lasting many hours. Sometimes ferry service became impossible, and every interruption mattered. By this point, the Trans-Siberian Railway was more than a symbolic project. People and goods were already depending on it. The gap at Baikal had become one of its weakest links. A train could travel across thousands of miles, only to reach the lake and wait. Passengers waited. Freight waited. Mail waited. Military supplies waited. Time accumulated on the shore. The empire had built an iron road across a continent and discovered that its schedule could still be controlled by ice. For ordinary travelers, the delays produced scenes that were sometimes uncomfortable, but strangely intimate. Waiting rooms filled. People drank tea. Samovars hissed. Luggage accumulated. Children slept against bundles and coats. Railway employees attempted to explain uncertain departures. Merchants worried about cargo. Officials checked watches. Outside, wind moved snow across the station yard. Beyond the windows lay the frozen lake. One could feel the contradiction everywhere. Modern machinery had arrived. Telegraph wires connected distant cities. Steam locomotives had crossed Siberia. Yet the most important information at the station might still be something very simple. The ice is too difficult today. We cannot cross. The lake does not care about the timetable. There were efforts to overcome this winter interruption in other ways. When the ice became sufficiently strong, people and goods could travel across the frozen surface by sledge. Temporary routes were marked. Horses crossed the lake. Freight moved slowly over the ice. During the crisis years at the beginning of the 20th century, even more ambitious attempts were made to create a temporary railway connection directly across the frozen lake. Rails were laid upon the ice during winter. Railway cars could be moved across with animal power rather than relying entirely on normal locomotive operation. The image is almost unreal. A railway laid not on earth, not on stone, not on a bridge, but on a frozen lake. Steel resting above deep water, workers standing in snow, horses pulling railway cars across an expanse of ice. The entire arrangement depended on weather. It was infrastructure that existed only because winter was cold enough, and everyone understood what lay beneath. Baikal is extraordinarily deep. The ice could be thick, but the darkness below extended downward for hundreds and, in places, more than 1,000 meters. A traveler crossing the lake in winter needed only to look at a dark fracture in the ice to be reminded that the solid surface was temporary. This was railway engineering reduced to its strangest form. The line had conquered thousands of miles of land. At Baikal, it balanced on frozen water. Still, the temporary solutions were never intended to be permanent. Surveyors and engineers were already attacking the real problem. The railway had to go around the southern end of the lake. The section that would eventually become famous as the Circum-Baikal Railway demanded an extraordinary concentration of engineering. The shoreline was beautiful. For railway builders, beauty meant trouble. Mountains rose directly from the water. Rock faces left almost no space for track. In some areas, the railway would have to be carved out of the slope. Where the mountain blocked the route, a tunnel had to pass through it. Where valleys or streams cut across the shore, bridges and culverts were required. Where unstable rock threatened the line, retaining structures and protective works had to be built. The project demanded stonecutters, blasters, tunnel workers, masons, carpenters, engineers, laborers, explosives, cement, steel, timber, and patience. Again, the difference between a map and reality became enormous. On paper, the southern shore was a curved line. On the ground, every bend contained another problem. Workers drilled holes into rock. Explosives were placed. The mountainside shook. Dust drifted toward the lake. Broken stone was cleared. Then the process began again. Tunnels advanced slowly from dark entrances. Inside, lamps illuminated wet walls. Smoke from blasting lingered in confined spaces. Water dripped from rock. Men worked with hammers and drills. Wagons carried rubble away. The tunnel extended another few feet. Then another. Outside, Baikal remained visible through the opening. Blue in summer, white in winter. Always there. The Circum-Baikal section required dozens of tunnels and galleries, along with a remarkable series of bridges, retaining walls, and masonry works. The density of engineering gave the route a character unlike the long open stretches of western Siberia. There, a traveler might look across plains stretching toward the horizon. Here, the railway clung to the edge between mountain and water. A cliff on one side. Baikal on the other. The train would eventually pass directly from tunnel darkness into sudden light. Then into another tunnel. Across a small bridge. Past a stone wall. Around another curve. The track seemed not to cross the landscape, but to negotiate with it continuously. Construction became especially urgent as international tensions in East Asia worsened. In 1904, war broke out between the Russian Empire and Japan. Suddenly, the Trans-Siberian Railway became critically important for moving men and supplies toward the Far East. The railway had always possessed military significance. Now that significance became immediate. Every weakness mattered. Single-track sections limited capacity. Incomplete connections caused delays. And Baikal remained an interruption just when the empire most needed an uninterrupted route. The war increased pressure to complete the railway around the lake. Work accelerated. Men labored through conditions that left little room for the leisurely pace of ordinary construction. The Circum-Baikal line was brought into operation during this period, with regular traffic developing as the difficult connection was completed. At last, trains no longer needed the lake ferry as an essential link in the main-through route. The rails continued around Baikal. Continuous steel had won, at least in the language of railway planners. Yet saying that the railway had conquered Baikal would be misleading. The tracks did not cross the lake. They went around it. The mountains had forced engineers to tunnel. The shoreline had forced them to build walls. The ice had forced them to use ships and temporary winter routes. Nature had not surrendered. Human beings had adapted. That distinction matters. Engineering is often described as mastery over nature. The history of Baikal suggests something more subtle. The strongest engineering does not simply overpower a landscape. It learns where resistance is too great. It changes direction. It waits. It reinforces. It tunnels. It follows the shore. The final route was an agreement written in stone and steel. Years later, a passenger sitting in a warm railway carriage might experience the Circum-Baikal section almost peacefully. The train moves slowly beside the lake. Its wheels repeat their familiar rhythm. Outside, morning mist lies over the water. Mountain shadows stretch across the surface. The locomotive enters a tunnel. For a moment, the window becomes black. Sound changes. The beat of the wheels grows louder inside the stone chamber. Steam echoes. Then suddenly the train emerges. Light returns. Baikal is there again. Huge. Still. Blue beneath the sky. A passenger might open the window slightly and feel cold air enter the compartment. He might see fishermen near the shore. A small village. A boat. Stonework beneath the track. Snow remaining high on the mountains, even as lower ground begins to thaw. And perhaps he would never think about the men who blasted the tunnel around him. That is the strange fate of successful infrastructure. Difficulty disappears into convenience. Once a railway works, people stop noticing the problems it solved. The traveler sees scenery. The engineer sees retaining walls. The worker remembers dust. By the time continuous rail service around the southern shore became possible, Lake Baikal had already written itself permanently into the mythology of the Trans-Siberian journey. No other place along the route represented the confrontation between machinery and landscape quite so clearly. The Ob had been bridged. The Yenisei had been bridged. Mountains could be cut. But Baikal had forced the railway to stop, unload its passengers, board a ship, and ask permission from the weather. For a few extraordinary years, an imperial railway became a maritime route. Steam locomotives arrived at the edge of an ancient lake. Railway cars boarded an icebreaker. Passengers crossed dark water under distant mountains. In winter, horses moved freight across frozen silence. And while engineers carved a permanent path into the cliffs, the lake continued through its seasons without concern. Freeze. Snow. Thaw. Wind. Summer light. Then ice again. Tonight, imagine that earlier crossing before the shore railway was complete. It is late. The train has stopped. You step from the carriage into the cold. Your boots touch snow on the platform. Porters move luggage beneath lamps. Steam drifts around the locomotive and disappears into darkness. Ahead, beyond the station, lies Baikal. The moon is high enough to illuminate the frozen surface. The lake stretches away until distance turns it pale. Mountains stand along the horizon like dark walls. Somewhere beneath the ice is water deeper than anyone around you can truly imagine. Behind you are thousands of miles of railway leading toward European Russia. Ahead are thousands more leading toward the Pacific. But for this moment, nothing moves. No locomotive. No carriage. No schedule. Only the wind crossing the ice. Then, somewhere in the darkness, comes a sound. A low crack rolls beneath the frozen lake. It travels farther than you can follow. And then the silence returns. Baikal has said what it needed to say. The railway may continue. But here it must go slowly. A railway does not only connect places. Sometimes it creates them. Across Siberia, the first sign of a future town was often very small. A wooden platform. A water tower. A telegraph office. A warehouse. A siding where freight cars could wait. Perhaps a few houses for railway workers. Perhaps a stove glowing inside a station room, while snow moved across an otherwise empty landscape. At first, there might be almost nothing else. Then a merchant arrived. Then a blacksmith. Then a family looking for land. Someone opened a tea room. Someone built a stable. Someone began selling bread. A church appeared. A school followed. A dirt road led toward the station. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment, a stopping place became a settlement. Then a settlement became a town. The Trans-Siberian Railway did not merely cross Siberia. It began to rearrange it. Before the railway, many communities had been oriented toward rivers. That was natural. Rivers were transportation routes. They carried people, timber, fish, grain, and trade. Villages often faced the water because the river connected them with the outside world. The railway introduced a new geography. Now, the important line was made of steel. A village several miles from a station might suddenly feel isolated. A newer settlement built directly beside the track could grow quickly. Merchants began asking a new question. Not only where is the river, but where is the railway? Stations became magnets. Some were barely more than practical facilities. Others developed into important centers. At a major station, the scene could be surprisingly busy. A locomotive arrived under a cloud of steam. Porters moved luggage. Freight was unloaded. Telegraph operators received messages. Water was pumped into tenders. Coal or wood was loaded. Passengers stepped down to stretch their legs. Vendors appeared with food. Someone sold bread. Someone offered boiled eggs. Someone carried smoked or dried fish. Tea was everywhere. In the waiting room, a samovar stood hot and polished, its steam rising into the warm air. Outside, Siberia might be far below freezing. Inside, passengers removed gloves and held cups between their hands. For a few minutes, strangers shared the same room. A government official, a soldier, a merchant, a peasant family moving east, an engineer traveling to a new posting, a mother with children, a railway clerk, a man returning home after years away. Then a bell sounded. People gathered their belongings. The locomotive gave a whistle, and the temporary little society of the waiting room dissolved. Some traveled east. Some traveled west. Some stayed behind. The station remained. This rhythm was repeated across thousands of miles. Arrival, waiting, departure, again and again. And with each repetition, Siberia became less isolated. For peasant families in European Russia, the railway opened a possibility that had once seemed almost unreachable. Land. Population pressure in parts of the empire was severe. Many rural families possessed too little land to support themselves comfortably. Farms were divided among generations. Soil could be poor. Taxes and obligations added pressure. Siberia, by contrast, appeared vast. The government increasingly encouraged migration eastward. The railway made that migration possible on a scale that older roads never could. Families packed their lives into bundles. Clothing, cooking pots, blankets, tools, seeds, religious icons, small savings, perhaps a few books, perhaps nothing that could not be carried. Then they went to the station. For many, boarding a train was itself a remarkable experience. A peasant who had spent most of his life within a few dozen miles of one village might suddenly be traveling thousands of miles. The family climbed into a carriage crowded with other migrants. There was little luxury. Migration trains could be uncomfortable. Space was limited. The journey was long. Children became restless. Food had to be managed carefully. Illness could spread through crowded cars. Yet the movement continued. Outside the windows, familiar countryside disappeared. Then the Urals. Then the plains of Siberia. Day after day, the landscape changed slowly. At stations, families stepped down for water and food. They listened for announcements. They worried about missing the train. They asked other passengers how much farther remained. Perhaps they carried a paper naming a district where land had been assigned. Perhaps a relative had already moved east and sent back encouraging news. Perhaps they knew almost nothing about the place waiting for them. The train continued. At night, children slept against bundles. Adults talked quietly. Some prayed. Some argued. Some wondered whether they had made a terrible mistake. Then, one day, the railway official called the name of their station. The family gathered everything. They stepped down. The train moved away. And silence returned. This moment must have been terrifying. A railway station could create the illusion of connection. But once the train disappeared, a family might find itself surrounded by forest, grassland, mud, or snow. The new home was not waiting in finished form. Land had to be cleared. A house had to be built. Food had to last until the first successful harvest. Winter would arrive, whether the settlers were ready or not. Migration meant possibility. It also meant risk. Some settlers succeeded. They established farms, built houses, raised children, sold grain through the railway. Their villages grew. Others struggled. Crops failed. Livestock died. Illness struck. Money ran out. Some families returned west if they could. Others remained because there was nowhere else to go. The railway made movement easier. It could not guarantee happiness at the destination. Still, the migration transformed Siberia. The population increased. Agricultural production expanded in many regions. Grain moved towards railway stations. Butter became an important Siberian export. Timber traveled by rail. Livestock, flour, fish, coal, and other goods entered wider markets. The railway was changing not only where people lived, but what they produced. Before reliable transport, a farmer had to think locally. If grain could not be sold far away, there was little reason to produce enormous surpluses. A railway changed the calculation. Now, produce could travel hundreds or thousands of miles. The horizon of the market expanded. A small farm in Siberia became connected, however indirectly, to consumers who would never see the field where their food had grown. The same was true of merchants. A shopkeeper beside a railway station could receive goods that had traveled from European Russia or even from abroad. Fabric, tools, machinery, sugar, tea, manufactured products, newspapers, books. Objects that had once been rare in remote settlements became easier to obtain. The station became a doorway through which the larger world entered. It also became a place where news arrived. Telegraph wires had already accelerated communication. Railway newspapers and passengers carried stories farther. A rumor from Saint Petersburg could reach a Siberian town far more quickly than before. Political events no longer remained remote for as long. Commercial prices could be communicated. Families could send letters with greater reliability. Officials could receive instructions. Even time itself became more standardized. Before railways, local life was largely governed by the sun and the seasons. Noon was when the sun reached its highest point. A village did not need to care whether its clock agreed exactly with a town hundreds of miles away. Railways did care. Trains had schedules. Two trains sharing the same track had to know precisely when and where they were supposed to meet. Station clocks mattered. Timetables mattered. Minutes mattered. Across the enormous breadth of Russia, this created an interesting tension. The railway crossed many degrees of longitude. Local solar time changed continuously as trains moved east or west. Yet railway operations required a common reference. For many years, Russian railways used Saint Petersburg time and later Moscow time for schedules across vast distances. A passenger could stand at a station where the local sun suggested 1 hour while the railway clock followed another. The Iron Road had begun to impose its own time over the landscape. This may seem like a small change. It was not. The railway taught communities to listen for whistles and watch clocks. A train did not wait because a farmer's morning had started late. It arrived according to a schedule. The station became a place where traditional seasonal rhythms met industrial time. Children growing up beside the tracks learned the sound of this new order. They knew when the morning train usually came. They knew the evening freight. They recognized different whistles. Some ran toward the railway when they heard an approaching locomotive. Others placed coins on the rail and waited to find them flattened after the train passed. Railway employees became familiar figures. The station master, the signal man, the telegraph operator, the track inspector, the engine driver, the fireman feeding fuel into the locomotive, the porter, the maintenance crew, A railway created entire categories of work that had barely existed in these places before. And railway employment could become a family tradition. A father worked on the track. His son learned the telegraph. A daughter married a station employee. Another generation entered the railway service. In isolated communities, the railway company or state railway administration could become one of the most important employers. The station was more than architecture. It was an institution. Some stations were modest wooden buildings. Others, especially at important cities, became larger and more decorative. Architecture announced hierarchy. A minor stop might offer a small waiting room and a simple office. A major station could contain separate waiting areas, dining facilities, baggage rooms, ticket offices, and administrative spaces. Travelers could often sense the importance of a city before they left the platform. Yet even the smallest station could feel remarkable at night. Imagine one standing alone beneath winter darkness. Snow lies deep on both sides of the track. A few lamps burn beneath the eaves. Smoke rises from a chimney. Inside, the station master writes at a desk. A telegraph instrument clicks. Someone tends the stove. Perhaps two passengers wait on a wooden bench. There is tea in a glass. A clock ticks on the wall. Outside, there is nothing but darkness. Then the rails begin to vibrate. A faint sound emerges from the distance. The passengers look toward the window. A light appears between the trees. It grows larger. Steam becomes visible in the moonlight. The train arrives with noise and heat and movement. For several minutes, the station is transformed. Doors open. Voices fill the platform. Mailbags are thrown down. Packages are loaded. Someone embraces a relative. Someone says goodbye. Someone runs because the train is leaving. Then the whistle sounds again. The carriages move. The red lamp at the rear becomes smaller, and the station returns to silence. This cycle gave remote places a sense of belonging to something larger. A person could look at the rails and know that one direction led eventually toward Moscow. The other led toward the Pacific. Even if that person never traveled farther than the neighboring town, the possibility existed physically beneath his feet. The track connected imagination as much as geography. Cities along the route changed rapidly. Omsk became an increasingly important railway and administrative center. Krasnoyarsk benefited from its position on the line and its great bridge. Irkutsk, already an important Siberian city, became even more closely tied to east-west movement. The settlement at the Ob crossing grew into Novosibirsk, one of the clearest examples of a city whose rise was inseparable from the railway. Farther east, Chita and other communities became significant railway nodes. Workshops appeared where locomotives and rolling stock could be repaired. Depots employed large numbers of people. Warehouses expanded. Industrial districts grew near the tracks. Rail yards became landscapes of their own. Rows of freight cars, coal piles, water towers, turntables, repair sheds, signal posts, steam drifting between locomotives, the sound of metal striking metal. These places were the mechanical hearts of the new Siberia. They were rarely beautiful in the traditional sense. They were smoky, dirty, noisy, but they represented reliability. A locomotive that broke down in the wilderness was a serious problem. A locomotive that reached a major workshop could be repaired. Wheels could be inspected, boilers serviced, parts replaced. Machines that had crossed thousands of miles were kept alive by mechanics working beneath them with lamps and tools. Behind every elegant image of a train crossing snow stood an army of people maintaining it. The railway also altered older patterns of trade. Some river transport remained essential. In fact, railways and rivers often worked together rather than simply replacing one another. Goods arrived by boat and transferred to rail. Rail freight reached river ports and continued by water. But towns that depended entirely upon older routes could find themselves bypassed by the new economy. A thriving coaching station on the old Siberian road might lose travelers. An innkeeper who once served horse traffic might see business decline. A ferry crossing could become less important after a railway bridge opened. Progress created ruins, even as it created cities. The abandoned road and the new railway could sometimes lie only a short distance apart. One belonged to a world of horses, the other to steam. For older travelers, the difference must have been astonishing. A journey that once required weeks of discomfort could now pass in days. A river that once forced long delays could be crossed without leaving the carriage. A winter road that had once vanished beneath snow was replaced by tracks maintained through storms. The railway did not eliminate hardship, but it changed what people considered a normal journey. It also brought more outsiders into Siberia. Tourists, scientists, officials, businessmen, foreign travelers, writers. The region became easier to describe because it became easier to visit. That had cultural consequences. Siberia slowly became less mythical to people in the West. It remained distant. It remained severe, but it was no longer unreachable. One could buy a ticket. That simple fact transformed imagination. A ticket converted the unknown into a destination. Yet the railway's growth also intensified pressure on indigenous peoples and communities whose lands were increasingly penetrated by settlement, industry, and state authority. Forests were cut. Hunting territories changed. Migrants arrived in large numbers. Markets altered traditional economies. Disease and administrative control followed transportation. The railway was a source of opportunity for many people, but the benefits were unevenly distributed. Every new station represented connection. It also represented intrusion. The story of development was never only one story. By the early 20th century, Siberia was becoming something very different from the place imagined by officials only a few decades earlier. It was still enormous, still cold, still sparsely populated across vast regions. But it had acquired a spine. Along that spine, people moved. Grain moved. Mail moved. Machines moved. Ideas moved. Hope moved. So did disappointment. A family could begin again because of the railway. A merchant could become wealthy because of the railway. A town could be born because of the railway. And a community could also be bypassed, disrupted, or transformed by the same line. Steel did not decide what kind of future people would have. It simply accelerated the arrival of that future. At night, the railway stations continued their quiet work, one after another, separated by miles of darkness. Each station a small pool of light, a lamp beneath the roof, a telegraph office, a stove, a station clock, perhaps a dog sleeping near the luggage room, perhaps snow gathering on the platform, perhaps one traveler awake while everyone else rests. Then, somewhere far down the track, a whistle. The sound approaches. The rails tremble. The locomotive enters the light. And for a moment, the entire distant world seems to arrive with it. Letters from Moscow. Tea from farther east. A soldier. A student. A widow. A merchant. A child seeing Siberia for the first time. A railway mechanic going home. A box of machine parts. A bundle of newspapers. A sack of grain. Then the train departs. The station grows quiet again. But it is not isolated. Not anymore. Across the snow, another station waits. Then another. And another. A chain of lights stretching from west to east. Siberia, once imagined as a vast, empty space between distant cities, now possessed a rhythm. The rhythm of arrivals. The rhythm of departures. The rhythm of clocks and steam. the rhythm of steel wheels passing through the night. And with every train, the new Siberia moved a little closer to the world beyond the forest. The Trans-Siberian Railway had been built to overcome distance. But once it existed, distance was no longer the only thing moving along the rails. History moved with it. At first, the railway carried the things its planners had expected. Passengers, mail, timber, grain, machinery, settlers, government officials, railway workers. But the more complete the line became, the more it entered the life of the empire itself. And empires do not remain peaceful forever. By the beginning of the 20th century, the railway had become something far greater than a transportation project. It had become an artery. Everything important could now flow through it. And during years of crisis, almost everything did. Soldiers traveled east. Wounded men traveled west. Refugees crowded platforms. Prisoners were transported under guard. Military supplies filled freight cars. Political messages passed through telegraph offices. Rumors traveled in passenger compartments. News moved from station to station. A railway designed to hold an empire together began carrying the very forces that would transform that empire beyond recognition. The first great test came in the Far East. Russia had spent decades increasing its influence in northeastern Asia. The railway itself was part of that movement. The empire wanted access to ports, markets, military positions, and political influence. The Chinese Eastern Railway, constructed across Manchuria, created a shorter connection between Siberia and Vladivostok than a route remaining entirely within Russian territory. On the map, it seemed efficient. Strategically, it was complicated. Russia's ambitions increasingly collided with those of Japan. In 1904, war began. Suddenly, the Trans-Siberian Railway was asked to perform one of the most demanding tasks imaginable. It had to supply a major war thousands of miles from the empire's western population centers. Men boarded trains in European Russia and traveled east. Artillery followed. Ammunition, horses, food, medical equipment, uniforms, coal, replacement parts. Everything needed by an army had to pass along a railway that was still incomplete or limited in critical places. The problem was not simply distance. Much of the route had only a single track. A single-track railway requires careful coordination. Trains moving in opposite directions cannot simply pass wherever they wish. They must wait at designated sidings and stations. The more traffic increases, the more difficult the problem becomes. A delay in one place can spread across hundreds of miles. Military traffic placed enormous pressure on the system. Eastbound trains carried men and supplies. Westbound trains returned with wounded soldiers, empty wagons, officials, and other traffic. Station yards filled. Dispatchers worked under pressure. Telegraph operators transmitted instructions. Locomotives ran hard. Maintenance became more difficult, just as the line became more important. And there was still the problem of Lake Baikal. Before the Baikal section was fully available for regular traffic, trains could not simply continue around the lake. The ferry crossing created a bottleneck. In winter, ice made the problem worse. Military urgency helped accelerate completion of the permanent line around the southern shore. Engineers and workers labored to close the gap. The war was revealing something railway planners had always understood in theory. A chain is only as strong as its weakest section. Thousands of completed miles mattered little if one narrow point could delay an entire army. The Russian military discovered just how difficult it was to support a distant conflict through a railway of limited capacity. The line eventually became more capable. Passing loops were improved. Track was strengthened. Additional infrastructure was added. But the war had already demonstrated the limits of the system. The empire had built an iron road across Asia. It had not yet built enough of one. In 1905, Russia's military difficulties abroad were accompanied by deep unrest at home. Strikes, protests, political agitation, violence, demands for change. Across the empire, railway workers became important participants in the disturbances. This was another unexpected consequence of the railway age. Railways concentrated workers in depots, workshops, stations, and operating centers. These workers possessed specialized skills. They were connected with one another across great distances. And when railway workers stopped working, the consequences could be immediate. A railway strike did not remain inside one factory. It interrupted movement. Passengers waited. Freight stopped. Mail was delayed. Government control weakened. The same infrastructure that allowed the state to reach distant regions also gave organized workers an unusual form of influence. The contradiction was becoming clear. The railway strengthened central authority, but it also connected people, and connected people could share information. Ideas moved beside freight. Newspapers passed from hand to hand. Political pamphlets traveled in luggage. Workers discussed wages and conditions. Students carried arguments from the cities. Soldiers carried stories from their units. Migrants carried news from villages. The train compartment became a strange social room in motion. People who would never have met before the railway now sat facing one another for hours or days. A railway did not determine what they believed, but it made encounters possible. After the upheavals of 1905, the empire continued. So did the trains. The Trans-Siberian system was expanded and improved. One major goal was to reduce dependence on the route through Manchuria. Construction of the Amur Railway pushed forward through Russian territory north of the Chinese border. This was expensive and difficult. The region was remote. The terrain was challenging. But the strategic logic was powerful. Russia wanted a continuous route to Vladivostok that remained entirely within imperial territory. By 1916, with the completion of the Amur connection and the Great Bridge across the Amur River near Khabarovsk, the main railway route across Russia could finally run from European Russia to the Pacific without depending on foreign territory. It had taken roughly a quarter of a century since the Grand Imperial beginning of 1891. But by the time this continuity was achieved, the world was already at war again. In 1914, Europe entered the First World War. The Trans-Siberian Railway was far from the principal battlefields in the West. Yet it became vital in another way. Russia needed supplies. The war consumed equipment, ammunition, machinery, clothing, medicine, and food on an enormous scale. Goods arrived through Pacific ports, including Vladivostok. From there, they could move westward by rail. A line built in part to send Russian power toward Asia now carried material from the Pacific toward European Russia. The direction of strategic necessity had reversed. Again, freight yards filled. Again, dispatchers struggled with capacity. Again, locomotives and crews were pushed hard. War did not care that the railway had originally been conceived for different traffic. It used whatever existed. By 1917, the imperial system was collapsing. Years of war had exhausted the economy. Food distribution deteriorated. Transport networks were strained. Cities suffered shortages. Political confidence disappeared. In February 1917, the monarchy fell. Nicholas II, who as a young heir had participated in the ceremony marking the beginning of the Great Eastern Railway, abdicated the throne. The symbolism is difficult to ignore. The dynasty that had launched the Trans-Siberian Railway did not survive long enough to see what the railway would become. Yet the Iron Road remained. Governments can vanish far more quickly than infrastructure. Locomotives still needed water. Signals still had to be operated. Passengers still waited for trains. Station masters still checked clocks. History had changed above the tracks. The tracks continued beneath it. Later in 1917 came another revolution. The Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. Russia entered a new and deeply violent period. The country fragmented into civil war. Armies moved across enormous distances. Regional governments appeared. Foreign forces intervened. Different political movements struggled for control. And once again, the Trans-Siberian Railway became essential. In Siberia, control of the railway often meant control of movement itself. A force holding key stations could transport men and supplies. A force losing the line could become isolated. Railway junctions gained military and political importance far beyond their size. An ordinary station could become a strategic prize. One of the strangest episodes involved the Czechoslovak Legion. During the First World War, large numbers of Czech and Slovak soldiers had fought in Russia with the hope of contributing to the creation of an independent Czechoslovak state. After the Bolshevik Revolution and Russia's withdrawal from the war, arrangements were made for these troops to travel across Siberia toward Vladivostok, from where they could eventually continue their journey. The result was extraordinary. Thousands of armed men were spread along the Trans-Siberian Railway across vast distances. In 1918, tensions erupted into open conflict. The Legion seized control of important sections of the railway and many towns along the route. For a time, a military force made up largely of men from Central Europe exercised influence along an enormous corridor through Siberia. The railway had created a geographical possibility that would have been almost unthinkable before its construction. An organized force could exist across thousands of miles because trains and tracks connected it. During the Civil War, armored trains became particularly vivid symbols of railway power. These were locomotives and carriages protected with armor and equipped for combat. They moved along the tracks like small fortresses. But even these machines depended completely on the railway beneath them. Destroy a bridge, remove a rail, block a junction, and the armored train became trapped. The railway offered enormous mobility. It also created dependence. Every military force using the Trans-Siberian line understood this. Bridges were guarded. Stations were defended. Track was sabotaged. Repairs were made. Then sabotage came again. The peaceful infrastructure of schedules and freight had become part of a battlefield. But away from the fighting, civilians still used the railway because they had no alternative. Families fled violence. Refugees crowded trains. People carried what possessions they could. A suitcase, a blanket, food, documents, children, perhaps a family icon, perhaps jewelry hidden inside clothing, perhaps nothing at all. Stations became places of uncertainty. Which government controlled the next city? Was the line open? Would the train continue? Would there be food farther east? Would there be fighting at the next junction? A timetable once represented confidence. During civil war, it could become a hope. Imagine a family sitting in a crowded carriage during one of those years. The windows are fogged. The corridor is full of luggage. Someone is sleeping on the floor. A child asks when they will arrive. No one knows. Outside, the same Siberian forest passes as before. Birch, pine, snow, frozen rivers. The landscape seems unchanged. Inside the carriage, an entire political world is ending. Eventually, the Bolsheviks consolidated control over most of the former Russian Empire. The Soviet Union emerged in the early 1920s. The railway entered another age. The imperial eagles could disappear from station walls. Names could change. Officials could be replaced. But the practical problems remained surprisingly familiar. Rails needed maintenance. Bridges needed inspection. Locomotives needed coal and water. Workers needed housing. Freight needed to move. The new Soviet state inherited the railway because no government ruling such a vast territory could do without it. In the following decades, Siberia became central to Soviet industrial ambitions. New mines were developed. Factories expanded. Cities grew. Coal, timber, metals, machinery, and workers traveled along the railway. The system was improved, expanded, and increasingly integrated into a larger network. Stations that had begun as frontier outposts became industrial centers. Novosibirsk grew into a great city. Omsk expanded. Krasnoyarsk developed. Rail yards became larger. Workshops became more complex. The railway that had once introduced modern industrial time to Siberia became part of an entire industrial society. Then came another enormous test. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The main battlefront lay thousands of miles west of much of Siberia. But the Trans-Siberian Railway again became a lifeline. Industrial plants and workers were evacuated eastward away from advancing German forces. Factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved into the interior. People traveled with machinery. Entire industrial operations were reconstructed far from their original homes. Siberian and Far Eastern resources moved west. Troops moved across the country. Supplies arriving through the Pacific also entered the Soviet transport system in the east. The railway helped connect distant industrial regions with the war effort. The scale of movement was immense. Yet, at station level, it was still made of individual trains. One locomotive, then another, a dispatcher reading instructions, a mechanic beneath an engine, a woman waiting on a platform, a soldier drinking tea before departure, a freight car full of equipment, a family saying goodbye. History is often described through millions. Millions of soldiers. Millions of tons. Millions of passengers. Railways experience those millions one carriage at a time. After the war, the Trans-Siberian route continued changing. Steam locomotives gradually gave way to diesel and electric traction. Old structures were replaced. Double tracking expanded capacity. Electrification transformed operations across the route over decades. The railway became faster and more powerful than the line imagined by engineers of the 19th century. But beneath the new equipment remained the original idea. East and west, connected by steel. The political systems changed. The locomotives changed. Station signs changed. Borders shifted. Wars began and ended. Yet trains still departed. That continuity is one of the most remarkable things about the Trans-Siberian Railway. It was born from imperial ambition. It survived revolution. It survived civil war. It served a new state that rejected the monarchy responsible for building it. It carried armies, exiles, settlers, refugees, workers, tourists, prisoners, merchants, and families. It belonged fully to none of them. The railway was simply there. A road of iron through which every era had to pass. And perhaps the quietest way to understand this is not to imagine a battle or a political speech. Imagine instead a railway carriage at night. The year could be 1904, or 1917, or 1942, or many decades later. The passengers are different. The uniforms are different. The newspapers contain different names. But outside the glass, Siberia remains almost timeless. Snow gathers between the trees. A frozen river reflects the moon. A station appears in the distance. Its lamps grow brighter. The train slows. For a few minutes, history steps onto the platform. Soldiers, letters, orders, farewells, news. Then the whistle sounds. The station begins to move backward. Darkness returns. And beneath the carriage comes the steady rhythm that has survived all the storms above it. Steel against steel. Again. And again. And again. The empire that dreamed of the railway was gone. But the railway was still crossing the night. By the time the great railway entered the modern age, the dream that had once seemed nearly impossible had become ordinary. That may be the strangest ending of all. A project that demanded decades of argument, enormous expense, thousands of workers, Bridges across immense rivers, tunnels through rock, ferries across Lake Baikal, and endless repairs eventually became something people could simply use. A passenger could buy a ticket, carry a suitcase onto a platform, find a seat, watch the station begin to move backward, and then travel across a continent. No ceremony was required, no imperial decree, no team of horses, no river ferry at every great crossing. The extraordinary had become routine. Yet the Trans-Siberian Railway never became completely ordinary. Its scale resisted that. Even after faster locomotives replaced the early steam engines, even after stronger bridges, improved signaling, double track, and electrification transformed the route, the journey remained one of the longest continuous railway experiences in the world. From Moscow to Vladivostok, the tracks crossed an immense section of Eurasia. The journey passed through multiple time zones. It crossed the Ural Mountains and entered Asia. It passed great rivers whose names had once represented dangerous interruptions. It moved through cities that had grown because the railway existed. It approached Lake Baikal, where 19th century engineers had once been forced to stop and think again. Then it continued eastward, across territories that had once seemed almost unreachable from the capital. A traveler could spend days inside the train. That length created a special kind of life. A long-distance railway carriage becomes a temporary home. At first, passengers remain aware of departure. Bags are arranged. Tickets are checked. Coats are folded. Food is unpacked. People look carefully at one another. Strangers decide how much conversation they want. The train leaves the city. Buildings thin. Tracks multiply and then separate. Factories pass. Warehouses disappear. The landscape opens. Hours later, the journey settles into rhythm. The passenger stops measuring every mile. Time becomes softer. Morning is when pale light appears through the curtain. Afternoon is tea. Evening is the slow darkening of the window. Night is the repeated sound beneath the floor. The train moves. The passenger rests. Outside, the country passes whether anyone is watching or not. This is perhaps why the Trans-Siberian Railway became such a powerful symbol. It does not merely take a traveler from one city to another. It makes distance visible. Air travel can erase geography. An airplane rises above clouds. Hours pass. Then another airport appears. A railway does the opposite. It insists upon the land between destinations. Every forest must be crossed. Every river must be reached. Every mountain must be approached. Every station has a name. Distance is not removed. It is experienced. On a long Siberian journey, landscapes change slowly. The dense western cities recede. Open country expands. Birch forests appear. Fields extend toward low horizons. Industrial towns arrive and disappear. Great river bridges interrupt the pattern. Then more forest. More stations. More night. The Ural Mountains themselves do not appear as an impossible wall. The train passes through them almost quietly. But somewhere along that crossing lies the old symbolic boundary between Europe and Asia. A passenger may look outside and wonder whether the landscape truly changed. Of course, it did not change at a single line. Continents are human categories. The forest does not know where Europe ends. The snow does not know where Asia begins. The rails simply continue. That continuation is the essence of the railway. The original builders had wanted to transform a vast empire into a connected space. They succeeded in ways they could predict, and in ways they could not. The railway encouraged settlement. It expanded markets. It strengthened cities. It accelerated communication. It supported military movement. It helped industries grow. But it also changed imagination. Before the railway, Siberia could be represented as distance itself, a place of exile, a remote frontier, a cold unknown. After the railway, Siberia became a journey. There was a route through it, a sequence. A traveler could name the stations: Yekaterinburg, Omsk, Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, Irkutsk, Ulan-Ude, Chita, Khabarovsk, and finally Vladivostok. The names became part of a continental rhythm. Some travelers came for work, some for necessity, some for adventure. Some were railway employees who had made the journey many times. Some were foreign visitors who had imagined Siberia for years before finally seeing it through a carriage window. Each experienced a different railway. To the tourist, the line might seem romantic. To the railway worker, it was a workplace. To a soldier, it could mean deployment. To a migrant, a new beginning. To a prisoner, forced movement. To a child, perhaps it was simply the train that carried the family to visit relatives. Infrastructure has no single memory. It gathers many. The stations remember departure and arrival equally. One platform can hold contradictory emotions within the same hour. A family reunites beside one carriage. A few yards away, another family says goodbye. A student leaves home for the first time. A worker returns after months away. Someone arrives in a new city with confidence. Someone else arrives with fear. The train is indifferent to all of them. Its doors close. The signal changes. The journey continues. Over the 20th century, the physical railway changed dramatically. The light rails and more fragile structures of the pioneering era were strengthened or replaced. Steam locomotives that once filled stations with smoke and cinders gradually disappeared from regular service. Diesel engines and electric locomotives took their place. Electrification spread across the vast system over many years until the principal Trans-Siberian route became fully electrified. The transformation altered the sound of the railway. The old steam locomotive breathed. It hissed. It clattered. It released clouds of white vapor into winter air. An electric locomotive moved with a different confidence. Cleaner. More powerful. Less theatrical. But beneath either engine remained the same fundamental geometry. Two rails. A measured distance between them. A path east and west. Many of the old stations changed as well. Wooden buildings were replaced. Platforms expanded. Concrete appeared. New apartment blocks rose in cities that had once consisted of a few railway houses. Rail yards became enormous. Signals became more sophisticated. Passenger cars became more comfortable. Yet traces of the old railway survived. A stone bridge abutment. An older station building. A water tower no longer needed by steam locomotives. A section of abandoned alignment near Lake Baikal. A photograph of workers standing beside newly laid track. These remains are quiet because their great urgency has passed. A century ago, a water tower could determine whether a locomotive continued. Today, it may stand empty. Once, hundreds of men worked to force a tunnel through a cliff. Now, passengers pass through in minutes. This is what time does to engineering. It changes miracles into scenery. The Trans-Siberian Railway also became larger than a single route in popular imagination. The name often evokes not only the original main line, but an entire family of long railway journeys across northern Eurasia. Connections toward Mongolia and China became famous in their own right. Other great Siberian railway projects were developed farther north and through additional regions. The rail network grew beyond what the planners of the 1890s could have imagined. But the original idea remained powerful. Moscow, Siberia, the Pacific, one iron road across an enormous country. Its endurance also makes the railway a kind of timeline. A train traveling east seems to pass not only through geography, but through layers of history. Here is a city that grew around a bridge. Here is a station once crowded with imperial officials. Here is a junction that mattered during civil war. Here is a region transformed by Soviet industry. Here is Lake Baikal, older than every state that ever tried to organize the land around it. The railway carries all of these histories at once. Nothing about the modern track reveals them automatically. You have to know where to look. Perhaps that is true of all old infrastructure. A bridge can appear silent, but beneath its present traffic are the men who set its foundations. A station can appear ordinary, but its platform may have witnessed millions of departures. A railway cutting through a hillside may seem natural after enough years. But once, workers stood there with drills, explosives, picks, and lamps. The finished object hides the difficulty of its birth. To remember the Trans-Siberian Railway properly is therefore to remember more than emperors and ministers. It is to remember the unnamed. The surveyor walking through wet grass with instruments on his back. The laborer lifting a sleeper. The carpenter building a camp. The bridge worker looking down at dark water. The cook waking before sunrise. The doctor treating an injured man far from a hospital. The telegraph operator listening to a machine click in a lonely station. The engine crew feeding a locomotive through a winter night. The woman waiting with children and luggage on a platform. The migrant farmer stepping down somewhere east of the Urals and realizing that this unknown place was now home. The convict who worked on a project he had no freedom to leave. The indigenous family watching new tracks enter a landscape their people had known for generations. No single monument can contain all of these people. The railway itself is the monument. Not because it honors everyone fairly. History rarely does. But because their labor remains embedded in the root. Every completed mile depended on human effort. And every journey taken afterward rested upon that effort. There is another meaning hidden in the story. The builders believed they were defeating distance. In a practical sense, they were correct. Travel became faster. Communication improved. Markets connected. Government became more capable of reaching remote territory. But distance was never truly defeated. The Trans-Siberian journey remained long because Russia remained enormous. A passenger could sleep, wake, eat, watch an afternoon pass, sleep again, and still be hundreds or thousands of miles from the destination. The railway did not eliminate distance. It gave distance a rhythm. That rhythm may be why the journey remains so compelling. There is no need to hurry. The train cannot become impatient. It follows the track. The rails determine the direction. Signals determine when it stops. Stations divide the journey into manageable pieces. The passenger is permitted to surrender. There is something deeply restful in that. Outside the window, the forest does not ask anything. A frozen river passes beneath the train. A village appears. A dog runs beside a fence. Smoke rises from a chimney. Then everything disappears behind you. Another landscape comes. Another station. Another hour. At Lake Baikal, perhaps morning arrives. The water lies beyond the window, blue and enormous. Mountains rise across it. The train moves along the shore where engineers once cut tunnels through stone. Imagine looking through the glass. For a moment, the surface of the lake reflects the sky so perfectly that it becomes difficult to know where water ends and air begins. Then the train enters a tunnel. Darkness. The sound of wheels becomes louder. For several seconds, the carriage window reflects only the interior. Your own face. A lamp. A sleeping passenger. Then daylight returns. Baikal appears again. The lake has outlived the empire that built the railway. It has outlived wars, revolutions, governments, locomotives, generations of passengers. And it will almost certainly outlive the trains moving beside it tonight. Farther east, the landscape continues. Ulan-Ude, Shita, the long regions beyond. Eventually, the journey approaches the Amur, then Khabarovsk. Then the country begins turning toward the Pacific. After days of rail travel, the idea of Vladivostok becomes real. Signals multiply. More buildings appear. Rail yards expand. The train begins slowing through the outskirts. Passengers gather belongings that have been scattered around their temporary home. Blankets are folded. Cups are put away. Bags return to the corridor. People look different from the strangers who boarded days before. The journey has created small familiarities. A nod. A final conversation. A helping hand with luggage. Then the train enters the station. The journey ends. But the railway does not. Soon, the carriages will be cleaned. Another locomotive will arrive. Another group of passengers will find their places. Far to the west, other trains are already moving east. Far across Siberia, station lamps are burning. Freight trains are passing beneath darkness. Track workers are inspecting rails. Dispatchers are watching movements on screens. The Iron Road remains alive because thousands of ordinary actions continue every day. And tonight, in imagination, perhaps we do not need to arrive at Vladivostok at all. Perhaps we can remain somewhere between the beginning and the end. It is late. The carriage is warm. A small lamp glows above the corridor. Most passengers are asleep. The glass of the window is cool and faintly fogged. Outside, there is snow. Beyond the snow, dark trees. Beyond the trees, more distance than the eye can measure. Every few minutes, a telegraph pole or signal passes through the darkness. Then another. The wheels repeat their quiet pattern beneath the floor. There is no need to count the miles. No need to know the exact hour. The train already knows where it is going. More than a century ago, men looked at maps and imagined this sound. They imagined rails where there were none. Bridges where rivers interrupted the road. Stations where forests stood. Locomotives crossing a continent that still traveled largely by horse, boat, and foot. They imagined that steel could make an enormous country smaller. They were right. And they were wrong. The country remained enormous. The winter remained cold. Baikal remained deep. The forests remained dark. Human beings remained small. But now, through all of it, there was a line. A thin line of steel stretched across the snow. And along that line moved everything the builders could have imagined, and many things they could not. Settlers, soldiers, prisoners, children, machinery, letters, grain, coal, revolutions, farewells, homecomings, entire generations. The Trans-Siberian Railway was born from imperial ambition, but it became something larger than the empire that created it. It became a path through memory, a machine for measuring distance, a witness to change, and a reminder that some of humanity's greatest structures are not truly built by the famous people whose signatures appear on official documents. They are built by countless ordinary hands, hands that disappear, while the road remains. So, as the night becomes quieter, imagine one last view through the window. Snow moves gently beneath the moon. The forest stretches away into darkness. Inside the carriage, everything is warm. A glass of tea rests on the table. Somewhere farther down the train, a door closes softly. The wheels continue beneath you. Steady, patient, almost like breathing. There is no need to hurry toward the next station. There is no need to reach the Pacific tonight. For now, the train can simply carry us onward. Across the rivers, past the old bridges, beside the silent water of Baikal, through cities born from stations, across landscapes once marked as empty spaces on distant maps, eastward through the snow, through history, through darkness, along the iron road of a country too vast to remain still. And somewhere beyond the glass, beneath the pale Siberian night, the rails continue toward the horizon. Two thin lines of steel, quietly shining, going on, and on, and on. Thank you for staying with us until the very end here on Ancient Stories to Sleep. If this quiet journey through history helped you relax, unwind, or drift a little closer to sleep, please consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. Your support allows us to keep creating long, peaceful stories from the distant past and the forgotten corners of history. You can also leave a comment and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Until our next journey, may your night be calm, your thoughts be light, and your sleep be peaceful. Good night, and thank you for traveling through history with Ancient Stories to Sleep.